I am standing in a garden, not the kind cultivated by human hands, but a garden of the mind, where marble columns rise white against an evening sky, and the air itself seems to hum with the quiet weight of ancient thought. This is a place that exists somewhere between memory and philosophy, between the ruins of Rome and the stillness of an inner courtyard, where footsteps echo softly on worn stone, and voices from centuries past seem to whisper just beyond the edge of hearing. The light here is golden, the particular gold of late afternoon, when shadows grow long and the world softens at its edges, and everything and every leaf, every stone, every distant sound takes on a quality of timelessness, as though this moment has always existed and always will. In the center of this garden stands a fountain, its water flowing in a continuous stream, falling and rising, the sound a gentle constant that measures something deeper than hours, something more patient than years. Around the fountain, the columns stand in their silent arrangement, some whole, some broken, their surfaces marked by weather and time, by the passage of countless seasons, each imperfection a kind of testimony, each crack and worn place a record of endurance, the philosophy that was born in places like this, that emerged from corridors of power and quiet studies, from marketplaces and military camps, was not a philosophy of escape, but of engagement, not a turning away from the world, but a way of standing within it, firmly, calmly, with eyes open to both beauty and difficulty. The Stoics, as they came to be known, did not retreat to mountain tops or cloistered halls. They walked the streets of Athens and Rome. They served as counselors and emperors, as slaves and soldiers, and in all these roles and all these varied stations of life, they asked the same essential questions about virtue, about duty, about what it means to live well in a world that does not bend to our preferences. There is something about stone that captures the essence of this philosophy, its solidity, its patience, the way it endures frost and heat, rain and drought, without complaint, without expectation that the weather should be otherwise. I can almost see them, these ancient practitioners, walking through porticos in the early morning, their sandals soft on marble, their faces turned toward the rising sun, carrying with them not sacred texts or mystical formulas, but simple observations about life, about change, about the nature of things that are within our control and those that are not. The garden here, in this space of imagination and history, is not perfectly manicured. There are wild herbs growing between the stones, thyme and rosemary, their fragrance rising in the warm air. There are olive trees with their silver-green leaves, ancient and gnarled, bearing fruit season after season, regardless of praise or neglect. This is where we begin, in a place that feels both distant and immediate, both historical and eternal, where the foundations of an enduring wisdom were laid, not in moments of divine revelation, but in the steady accumulation of insight, in the daily practice of attention, in the careful observation of how life unfolds and how the mind responds. The sky above this garden is deepening now, moving from gold to amber, from amber to the first hint of violet, and the stars are beginning to appear, the same stars that shone over Athens and Rome, over the Mediterranean world where this philosophy first took root. the same configurations that guided sailors and inspired poets, and reminded philosophers that they were part of something vast, something that operated according to principles they could observe, but never fully command. There is no urgency here, no need to hurry toward conclusions, only an invitation to walk slowly through these columned spaces, to let the mind settle like dust after a traveler has passed, to consider with patience and curiosity what these ancient teachers discovered about the art of living and why their insights have traveled across centuries, unchanged in essence, still offering guidance, still holding up a mirror to the human condition. The fountain continues its eternal falling and rising, the water catching the last golden light, each drop part of a cycle that knows no beginning and no end, only continuation, only the patient working of natural law. And so we stand here, in this garden of thought, as evening gathers, and prepare to trace the lineage of an idea, to follow it from its origins through the great cities of the ancient world, to see how it was tested in palaces and prisons, in triumph and in exile, and how it offered to all who would receive it a way of being in the world that required no special circumstances, no particular fortune, only clarity, only discipline, only the willingness to see things as they are. The roots of this philosophy stretch back to a painted colonnade in Athens, a place called the Stoa Poikile. The painted porch, where citizens gathered to discuss ideas, to debate virtue and vice, to examine the nature of the good life. And it was here, in the shadow of these painted walls, that a merchant from Cyprus would plant the seeds of something enduring. His name was Zeno, and he arrived in Athens not as a philosopher, but as a trader, carrying a cargo of purple dye from Phoenicia, the precious substance that colored the robes of kings. But the sea had other plans, and his ship was wrecked off the coast of Piraeus, and everything he owned, all his commercial hopes, sank beneath the waves. It was around 300 years before the Common Era, and Athens was no longer the supreme power it had been in the days of Pericles, but it remained the intellectual heart of the Greek world, a place where schools of philosophy flourished like gardens, each offering its own path to wisdom, its own answer to the question of how to live. Zeno, having lost everything, found himself wandering into a bookseller's shop, and there he encountered the writings of Socrates, or rather the accounts of Socrates preserved by his student Xenophon, and something in those pages ignited a hunger in him, a desire not for wealth or status, but for understanding, for a different kind of treasure altogether. He sought out the cynic philosopher Crates, a man who had renounced his own fortune, who walked the streets of Athens in rough clothing, carrying all his possessions, teaching that happiness required nothing external, nothing that fortune could give or take away. And under this unconventional teacher, Zeno began his philosophical education, learning to question every assumption, every conventional value, every claim about what constituted the good. But Zeno's mind was too systematic, too architectonic, to remain satisfied with the cynic rejection of society. He wanted to build something, to create a comprehensive understanding of the universe and humanity's place within it. And so he studied with other teachers too, with the Platonists and the followers of Aristotle, absorbing their logic, their physics, their theories of knowledge, synthesizing these varied streams into something new. And eventually, around 294 years before the Common Era, Zeno began teaching in his own right, but he owned no property, no private school building, and so he gathered his students in a public colonnade, the Stoa Poikile, where anyone could come and listen, where rich and poor, citizen and foreigner could hear his vision of philosophy, and from this painted porch the movement took its name, Stoicism, the philosophy of the Stoa. The painted walls around them depicted scenes of Athenian glory, battles won, heroes celebrated, the proud history of the city. But Zeno's teaching pointed elsewhere, not to external achievement, not to fame or conquest, but to an interior citadel, a fortress of the mind that no army could breach, no misfortune could destroy. He taught that the universe was a rational whole, governed by logos, by divine reason, by a principle of order that manifested in everything from the movements of stars to the growth of trees, and human beings, uniquely among earthly creatures, participated in this logos, possessed reason themselves, and therefore had the capacity to align their will with the natural order, to live in harmony with the way things are. This was not a cold or mechanistic vision. The Stoics saw the universe as alive, as providential, as something closer to a vast organism than a machine. And they believed that everything that happened, every event, every circumstance, unfolded according to this rational principle, even when human understanding could not grasp the larger pattern. From this cosmological vision flowed their ethics. If the universe was rational and good, then the good life for a human being must consist in living according to reason, in developing virtue, which they understood not as a list of rules, but as a kind of excellence of character, a perfection of one's rational and social nature. They identified 4 cardinal virtues: wisdom, the knowledge of what is truly good and truly bad; courage, the willingness to endure hardship and face fear in service of what is right; justice, the commitment to give each person their due, to fulfill one's obligations to the human community; and temperance, the harmonious ordering of desires and emotions under the governance of reason. Everything else, everything that people typically pursued or feared, wealth and poverty, health and sickness, reputation and obscurity, pleasure and pain, even life and death, these were classified as indifference, things that had no bearing on one's true happiness, no power to make one truly good or truly bad. This was a radical teaching, shocking to common sense, for who does not fear death? Who does not prefer health to disease, wealth to poverty? But the Stoics were not denying that these things had a certain value, that some were preferable to others. They were denying that they were essential to happiness, to eudaimonia, to the flourishing that comes from living well. Zeno himself lived this teaching with remarkable consistency. He was known for his self-discipline, his indifference to luxury, his calm demeanor, and when he died, at a very advanced age, around 72 years old, the Athenians honored him with a public tomb, a rare distinction, and a bronze statue, testimony that his philosophy had touched something deep in the civic consciousness. But Zeno was only the beginning. The philosophy he founded would be developed and refined by a succession of brilliant thinkers, each adding their own insights, their own emphasis, their own applications of the core principles. There was Cleanthes, Zeno's successor as head of the school, a former boxer who supported himself by drawing water at night, who had the strength and endurance of an athlete, and who brought a religious intensity to Stoicism, writing hymns to Zeus that praised the rational principle governing all things, who saw philosophy not just as an intellectual exercise, but as a spiritual practice, a way of aligning oneself with the divine. And then came Chrysippus, perhaps the most intellectually formidable of the early Stoics, a man of legendary productivity, said to have written over 700 works, developing the logical and physical theories of Stoicism with extraordinary precision, defending the school against critics, systematizing its doctrines, building an elaborate edifice of argument and analysis. It was said in antiquity that if there had been no Chrysippus, there would have been no Stoa, for he gave the philosophy its rigorous structure, its technical sophistication, its capacity to stand against the skeptical attacks of the academy and other rival schools, though sadly, almost none of his voluminous writings survived the passage of centuries, and we know his thought mainly through fragments and the accounts of later authors. These early Stoics established the foundations, the three parts of philosophy as they understood it: logic, the study of correct reasoning and the criteria of truth; physics, the investigation of nature and the cosmos, including theology; and ethics, the art of living well. And they insisted that these three domains were inseparable, that one could not be truly virtuous without understanding the nature of reality, could not reason correctly without grasping the ethical implications of one's conclusions. In those early decades, the philosophy spread through the Greek-speaking world, carried by teachers and students, by merchants and travelers, finding adherents in the great cities of the Mediterranean, in Alexandria and Antioch, in Rhodes and Pergamon, wherever there were educated people seeking a rational approach to life's challenges, a way to navigate fortune and misfortune with equanimity. The teaching adapted itself to different contexts, different students. Some were drawn to its cosmopolitan vision, its insistence that all rational beings were citizens of a universal city, that national and ethnic boundaries were merely conventional, that the true sage was at home anywhere, belonging to humanity rather than to any particular place. Others were attracted by its practicality, its offer of concrete techniques for managing emotions, for examining impressions before assenting to them, for distinguishing what was up to them and what was not, for focusing their energy on what they could actually control, their own judgments, their own choices, their own character. And still others found in Stoicism a sense of meaning and purpose, a way of understanding suffering and difficulty not as arbitrary afflictions, but as part of the larger rational order, as opportunities for developing virtue, for practicing endurance and wisdom, for proving the strength of one's character. The painted porch in Athens continued to be a center of teaching, but the philosophy was never confined to one place, never the possession of a closed circle. It was from the beginning a public philosophy, offered freely, available to anyone with the capacity to reason, regardless of social station, regardless of nationality, and this democratic quality, this accessibility, would prove to be one of its most enduring features. As the decades passed, as the Roman Republic expanded its power eastward, absorbing the Greek world into its empire, Stoicism would travel westward too, carried by Greek teachers who came to Rome, by Roman aristocrats who studied in Athens, by the circulation of texts and ideas across the Mediterranean. And it would find in that harder more practical culture, a new expression, a new emphasis that would carry it to heights of influence and eloquence that even Zeno might not have imagined. But that transformation still lay ahead in these early years, in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era. The philosophy was finding its form, establishing its principles, training its practitioners in the art of living according to nature, according to reason, in the steady conviction that virtue alone was sufficient for happiness, and that the wise person could maintain inner freedom even in the midst of external constraint. The garden here grows darker, the violet sky deepening to indigo, and the first stars are now clearly visible, steady points of light in the vast turning heavens, the same stars that the early Stoics observed, finding in their regularity, in their eternal patterns, evidence of the rational principle they believed ordered all things. And so the philosophy began its journey westward, across the wine-dark sea, into the heart of an expanding empire, into Rome, where Greek culture was both admired and resisted, where practical men of affairs sought wisdom that could guide them through the complexities of power, through the moral ambiguities of conquest and governance. The Romans, who first encountered Stoicism in the 2nd century before the Common Era, were not philosophers by temperament. They were soldiers and senators, farmers and lawyers, people accustomed to action rather than contemplation. But they found in this Greek teaching something that resonated with their own traditional values, the emphasis on duty, on self-control, on endurance in the face of hardship, on service to the community. One of the earliest and most influential transmitters was Panaetius of Rhodes, a Greek philosopher who came to Rome around the middle of the 2nd century and entered the circle of Scipio Africanus the Younger, one of Rome's greatest generals. And there, in discussions with the Roman aristocracy, Panaetius began adapting Stoic teaching to Roman sensibilities, softening some of its more paradoxical claims, emphasizing its practical applications, its relevance to political life and moral education. He taught that philosophy was not an escape from public duty, but a preparation for it, that the study of ethics equipped one to be a better citizen, a better leader, a more reliable friend, and his influence spread through the Roman elite, shaping the moral education of generations, establishing Stoicism as the unofficial philosophy of the Roman governing class. His student Posidonius continued this work, traveling throughout the Mediterranean world, studying everything from tides and earthquakes to the customs of distant peoples, bringing to Stoicism a vast empirical curiosity, a desire to understand the physical world in all its detail while maintaining the ethical core, the insistence that knowledge must serve the cultivation of virtue. But it was in the 1st century before the Common Era, and the 1st century of the Common Era, that Stoicism would reach its fullest Roman expression, producing teachers and practitioners whose words would echo through the centuries, whose writings would become the primary sources through which later ages would encounter this ancient wisdom. The Roman Forum in those days was a place of marble and ambition, of legal argument and political intrigue, where fortunes rose and fell with stunning speed, where today's consul might be tomorrow's exile, and it was in this volatile environment, this cauldron of human passion and power, that Stoic philosophy found its most challenging testing ground. Among the teachers of this era was Musonius Rufus, a Roman knight who taught in the middle years of the 1st century, who survived the turbulent reigns of Nero and Vespasian, enduring exile more than once for his philosophical convictions, and yet continuing to teach, continuing to insist that the only real harm was moral harm, that exile could not touch the inner freedom of the sage. His lectures, preserved in fragments, covered the practical details of daily life. Questions about marriage and family, about diet and exercise, about the education of children, about the proper relationship between men and women, and he argued, remarkably for his time, that women were equally capable of philosophy, equally rational, equally deserving of education and virtue. He taught outdoors, in gardens and public spaces, and his students remembered him not for technical arguments, but for the force of his example, for the way he lived what he taught, enduring poverty and exile with the same equanimity he had shown in comfort and favor, demonstrating that circumstances had no power over the soul that had truly grasped the Stoic principles. And among those students was a young man of unusual promise, born in Hierapolis in Phrygia, who came to Rome as a slave, belonging to Epaphroditus, a freedman and secretary to the Emperor Nero, and this young slave, whose name was Epictetus, would attend the lectures of Musonius whenever his duties allowed, absorbing the teaching, letting it transform his understanding of his own condition. Epictetus, even in slavery, even in chains, recognized that there was a part of himself that remained free, his capacity for judgment, his will, his moral purpose, and no master, no emperor, no circumstance could control this inner citadel unless he surrendered it himself, and this recognition became the foundation of his teaching, the core insight that he would later pass on to his own students. Eventually, he was freed. The historical record does not say how or when, but by the time the Emperor Domitian expelled philosophers from Rome near the end of the 1st century, Epictetus was a teacher in his own right, and he moved to Nicopolis in northwestern Greece, and there he established a school, living simply, teaching without fee, gathering around him students who would preserve his words, who would carry his teaching forward into the future. He wrote nothing himself, but one of his students, Arrian, a man who would later become a distinguished historian and military commander, took careful notes of his lectures, recording them in Greek, preserving not just the content, but something of the voice, the directness, the urgent, practical concern, the use of dialogue and example, the way Epictetus could move from abstract principle to concrete application with startling immediacy. These lectures, later organized into 8 books called the Discourses, with a shorter handbook called the Enchiridion, the manual, would become one of the primary sources for understanding Stoic philosophy, and their influence would extend far beyond the ancient world, shaping Christian monasticism, inspiring Enlightenment thinkers, speaking across the centuries to anyone who faced constraint, who struggled with circumstances beyond their control. The central teaching of Epictetus was simple to state. Though difficult to practice, there are things that are up to us and things that are not up to us. Our opinions, our impulses, our desires and aversions, our own actions, these are up to us, within our control, but our body, our property, our reputation, our office, everything external, these are not fully up to us. They depend on circumstances, on other people, on the unfolding of events in the world. And the fundamental error, the source of all our disturbance and unhappiness, is to treat what is not up to us as though it were, to set our heart on things we cannot control, to demand that the world conform to our preferences, to forget the true nature of external things, which are temporary, fragile, and ultimately indifferent to our wishes. Freedom, he taught, consisted not in having everything you want, but in wanting only what is up to you, in withdrawing your desire from externals, in focusing all your effort on developing a virtuous character, on maintaining right judgments, on acting appropriately in your given role and circumstances, whatever those circumstances might be. He would say to his students, "You are an actor in a play written by someone else. The playwright assigns the role. Whether you play a beggar or a king, a crippled person or an athlete, a long life or a short one, that is not up to you. What is up to you is to play the assigned role well, to bring excellence to whatever part you have been given." And he illustrated his teaching with vivid examples drawn from daily life: the broken cup, the crying child, the unjust accusation, the physical pain, the loss of loved ones, showing his students how to apply the principles to every situation, how to examine their impressions before assenting to them, how to distinguish what they could change from what they must accept. His lecture room in Nicopolis must have been a plain space, whitewashed walls perhaps, simple benches, the Mediterranean light falling through an open doorway, and there, in that unpretentious setting, surrounded by students from across the empire, Epictetus spoke with an urgency and directness that made philosophy feel not like an academic exercise, but like a matter of life and death, of freedom and slavery, of human dignity and degradation. He insisted that philosophy must be practiced, not just studied, that it was absurd to read books about Stoicism without applying the teachings, like reading a medical text, while refusing to take the medicine, or studying music theory while never touching an instrument. The point was transformation, the reshaping of character, the daily discipline of examining one's judgments and correcting one's errors. And while Epictetus taught in Nicopolis, while former slaves and future generals sat at his feet, learning to distinguish the voluntary from the necessary, in Rome itself, the philosophy was being practiced at the highest level of power in circumstances that would test its principles more severely than perhaps any classroom exercise ever could. For in the final years of the first century and the early decades of the second, Rome was governed by a series of capable emperors, and among them were men who took Stoic philosophy seriously, who tried to apply its principles to the challenges of imperial rule. None more famously than Marcus Aurelius, who would come to power in the year 161, and whose private notebooks would become one of the most intimate and enduring documents of Stoic practice. But before Marcus, there were others who showed what Stoicism could mean for public life, and the influence spread through the corridors of power, through the law courts, through the military camps, creating a shared moral vocabulary, a common framework for thinking about duty and virtue, about fate and freedom, about how to live with integrity in a world of ambition and corruption. The philosophy had traveled far from the painted porch in Athens, from the abstract arguments about logic and physics. It had become embodied, practical, tested against the realities of political life, of war and peace, of wealth and poverty, of freedom and slavery. And in each context, each set of circumstances. It asked the same fundamental questions: what is truly good? What is truly within my control? How should I think about the things that happen to me? How should I fulfill my roles and relationships? How can I maintain inner freedom regardless of external constraint? The Mediterranean world in these centuries was a place of tremendous cultural exchange, Greek and Roman, East and West, philosophy and religion, all flowing together, influencing each other, and Stoicism, with its cosmopolitan outlook, its emphasis on universal reason, its conception of a world city to which all rational beings belonged, fit naturally into this interconnected world, this empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. In the cities of this empire, in Alexandria and Antioch, in Carthage and Corinth, teachers expounded Stoic principles, students copied texts, educated people discussed the fine points of doctrine, and gradually the philosophy became part of the cultural fabric, shaping legal theory, influencing educational practice, providing a language for thinking about ethics that transcended local customs and particular traditions, and yet it never became merely academic, never lost its practical edge. Its insistence that philosophy must change how you live, must affect what you do when faced with loss, with injustice, with pain, with death. It remained a lived practice, a set of exercises and disciplines, a way of examining every impression, every impulse, every judgment, asking whether it was in accord with nature, whether it served virtue, whether it confused what was up to you with what was not. The evening deepens around this imagined garden, the stars now bright in the darkness, and the fountain continues its eternal music, the sound of water falling and rising, a rhythm that measures something beyond time, that speaks of cycles and patterns, of nature's patient working, of the rational order that the Stoics saw pervading all things, from the movement of planets to the growth of character, all part of one vast living whole. And so we come to Marcus Aurelius, born in the year 121, into a family of the Roman aristocracy, raised in privilege, educated by the finest teachers, groomed from youth for high office, and eventually, through a series of adoptions and dynastic calculations, designated to become emperor, the most powerful position in the known world. He did not seek this role. By all accounts, he would have preferred a life of philosophical study and quiet contemplation. But the Stoic teaching he had absorbed from his tutors, particularly from Junius Rusticus, who introduced him to the discourses of Epictetus, taught him that we do not choose our circumstances, only how we respond to them, and that each person has a duty to fulfill their assigned role, whatever that role might be. When he became emperor at the age of 40, he inherited an empire facing multiple crises, plagues sweeping through the provinces, barbarian invasions along the northern frontier, economic strain, political intrigue, and for the next 19 years until his death, he would struggle to maintain order, to protect the empire's borders, to administer justice, to manage competing factions and demands, all while trying to live according to the principles he had studied since childhood. During the long military campaigns on the frontier, in the cold camps along the Danube, in the brief intervals between councils of war and administrative duties, Marcus kept a private journal, writing in Greek, the language of philosophy, reflecting on the Stoic teachings, reminding himself of first principles, examining his own judgments and reactions, trying to maintain philosophical clarity amid the noise and pressure of imperial responsibility. These notes, never intended for publication, were later collected under the title Meditations, though a more accurate translation of the Greek would be to himself, for they are truly private reflections, a man's conversation with his own soul, exhortations and reminders, fragments of Stoic doctrine applied to his immediate circumstances, quotations from teachers he revered, all written with remarkable honesty and self-scrutiny. He reminds himself constantly of impermanence, that everything changes, that the empire he governs will one day crumble to dust, that he himself will soon be dead and forgotten, that all human achievements are tiny and brief against the vastness of time and space, and yet this awareness of transience does not lead him to despair, but rather to focus on what remains valuable: virtue, justice, kindness, the proper use of the present moment. He writes of the interconnection of all things, the way each part serves the whole, the way rational beings are made for cooperation, made to help each other, and he struggles with the difficulty of this, with the frustration of dealing with foolish or malicious people, and reminds himself that they too are his kin, fellow rational beings, however imperfectly they exercise their reason, and that his duty is to correct them if possible, to bear with them if correction fails, but never to hate them, never to betray the social nature that binds all humanity together. He reflects on death constantly, not morbidly, but as a fact to be faced clearly. Death is natural. It comes to everyone. It came to the great philosophers and emperors of the past. It will come to those who live after him, and there is nothing in it to fear. It is simply the dissolution of the elements that compose us, their return to the cosmic whole from which they came. And whether there is consciousness after death or not, the present duty remains the same: to live well now, to act justly now, to think clearly now. And throughout these reflections runs the fundamental Stoic distinction between what is up to us and what is not, between our judgments and our circumstances. And he returns to this constantly when insulted by a colleague, when facing military defeat, when grieving the loss of loved ones, when ill with the plague that ravaged his armies, asking himself, what in this situation is actually within my control, and directing his attention there to his own response, his own character, his own moral purpose. The meditations reveal the struggle, the difficulty of maintaining philosophical equanimity in the face of real pressures. This is not an abstract textbook written in peaceful retirement, but field notes from someone trying to practice Stoicism while bearing crushing responsibility, while chronically ill, while surrounded by war and death, while dealing with conspiracies and betrayals. And the honesty of this struggle makes the work compelling, makes it speak across centuries to anyone who tries to live by principles in difficult circumstances. He died in the year 180, likely of plague, in a military camp, still serving, still trying to fulfill his duty, still attempting to align his will with nature's will, and with his death, something shifted in the Roman world. The age of the good emperors ended. The empire began its long, slow transformation into something else, and Stoicism, which had reached perhaps its highest expression in his private notebooks, began to fade as a living school of philosophy. The reasons for this decline are multiple and complex. The rise of Christianity offered a different framework for understanding suffering and meaning, one that promised not just inner freedom, but cosmic redemption, personal immortality, divine love, and for many, especially those in positions of powerlessness, this proved more compelling than the stern self-reliance of the Stoics. The economic and political crises of the 3rd century disrupted the educational institutions where philosophy had been taught, scattered the communities of practitioners, made the leisured study of ethics seem like a luxury when survival itself was uncertain, and the great libraries where Stoic texts were preserved in Alexandria and elsewhere gradually lost their holdings through fire and neglect and the simple entropy of time. Moreover, Stoicism had always been more a practical discipline than a dogmatic system. It had no sacred scriptures, no priesthood, no institutional structure to preserve it through dark ages. It depended on each generation of teachers and students choosing to engage with it, to practice it, to pass it on, and when those chains of transmission were broken, when the schools closed and the teachers died without successors, much of the tradition was lost. By the 6th century, when the Emperor Justinian closed the philosophical schools in Athens, including the Stoa that had existed in various forms for nearly 800 years, ancient Stoicism as a living practice was essentially extinct. What remained were fragments, quotations in other authors, references in Christian writers who admired certain Stoic ideas while rejecting others, and a few complete works. Epictetus's discourses preserved by his student Arrian, Seneca's letters and essays, and Marcus Aurelius's private notebook, which survived more by accident than design. For centuries these texts were copied and recopied by monks in scriptoria, read by scholars, occasionally cited, but not widely known, not central to the intellectual life of medieval Europe, which had its own frameworks, its own questions, its own synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy, and Stoicism slept, dormant, waiting. But ideas that speak to something fundamental in human experience do not die. They hibernate, and the Renaissance, with its recovery of classical texts, its new printing technologies, its hunger for ancient wisdom, brought Stoic writings back into circulation. Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius were printed and translated, read by humanists and reformers, by Montaigne in his tower, writing essays that adapted Stoic themes to a Christian context, by military leaders and political thinkers looking for guidance in turbulent times. And in the centuries that followed, Stoic ideas would surface again and again, sometimes explicitly, sometimes absorbed so thoroughly into the culture that their origin was forgotten, in the emphasis on duty and self-control in European aristocratic education, in the focus on cognitive therapy in modern psychology, in the language of resilience and mental toughness in contemporary self-help, in the way people facing extreme adversity, prisoners of war, concentration camp survivors, would rediscover independently the core Stoic insight that the last human freedom is the freedom to choose one's attitude, one's response, even when everything else has been taken away. The philosophy that began in a painted colonnade in Athens, that was refined in Roman lecture halls and practiced in imperial palaces and military camps, that was written down in letters and essays and private notebooks, had proven remarkably durable, remarkably adaptable, speaking to something that transcends particular cultures or historical periods, something about the human condition itself, about the universality of suffering and loss, about the possibility of finding meaning and maintaining dignity regardless of circumstances. And perhaps this durability should not surprise us, for the Stoics did not claim to have invented something new. They claimed to have discovered something true, something built into the nature of reality, into the structure of rational existence. And such truths, if they are genuine, do not age, do not become obsolete. They wait patiently to be rediscovered, to be practiced, to be lived. The garden here has grown very dark now. Only starlight and the faint glow of the city below illuminate the columns and the fountain. And in this darkness there is a quality of stillness, of depth, as though the night itself were inviting a different kind of attention, a turning inward, a movement from historical narrative to something more intimate, more reflective, more personal. For we have traced the outward story, the succession of teachers and students, the adaptation of a Greek philosophy to Roman circumstances, the production of texts that would survive millennia. But there remains another story, the interior one, the question of what these ancient insights might mean, how they might function, what they offer to someone standing now in their own present moment, facing their own circumstances, their own limitations, their own mortality. And it is to this deeper consideration that we now turn, not leaving behind the history we have traced, but allowing it to settle to become not just knowledge about the past, but a living question about how to be, how to think, how to respond to the fact of being human in a world that does not conform to our preferences, a world that offers both beauty and suffering, both connection and loss, both meaning and the constant threat of meaninglessness. The fountain's voice continues, unchanged, patient, measuring something that cannot be hurried, cannot be controlled, only witnessed, only accepted, only perhaps harmonized with the question that the Stoics asked and that we might ask ourselves, sitting here in this darkened garden, listening to the fountain's eternal rhythm, is not whether we can control the world. Clearly we cannot, but whether we can shape our relationship to it, whether we can cultivate a certain quality of attention, a certain stance that allows us to meet what comes with clarity rather than confusion, with acceptance rather than futile resistance. This is where the philosophy moves from history into practice, from something that happened long ago to something that might happen now, in this present moment, in the space between one breath and the next, where judgment forms, where reaction crystallizes, where we decide, often without realizing we are deciding, how to interpret what occurs. The Stoics observed that we are disturbed not by things themselves, but by our judgments about things. A simple observation, easily stated, but profound in its implications, for it suggests that much of our suffering is optional, generated not by circumstances, but by the stories we tell about circumstances, the meanings we assign, the expectations we bring. Consider the fallen tree blocking a path. One person sees an obstacle, an annoyance, a disruption of plans. Another sees an opportunity, a chance to find a new route, to discover something unexpected. A third sees simply what is a tree that has fallen, requiring a response but not requiring emotional turbulence. And The tree itself, the physical fact, remains unchanged by these different interpretations. It is our relationship to it that varies, our judgment that creates either disturbance or equanimity. This insight opens a possibility that we might learn to observe our own judgments, to catch them in the moment of formation, to examine whether they are serving us well, whether they are based on truth or assumption, whether they are helping us respond skillfully or trapping us in unnecessary suffering. And this observation, this capacity to step back from our immediate reactions and examine them, is itself a kind of freedom, the freedom that remains even when outer freedom is constrained. The Stoics developed specific practices for cultivating this observational capacity. Morning and evening reflection, examining the events of the day and one's responses to them, asking what was done well and what might be improved, visualization of potential difficulties, not to worry about them, but to prepare oneself mentally to rehearse appropriate responses so that when challenges arose, they would not catch one off guard, would not trigger unconsidered reactions. They practiced negative visualization, imagining the loss of things they valued, not morbidly, but as a way of remembering that all external things are temporary, on loan as it were, and that appreciation deepens when we recognize impermanence, that we love more fully when we remember that everything beloved will one day be gone, including ourselves, including this very moment that will never come again. And they practice the discipline of assent, the deliberate pause between impression and judgment, the moment when an event occurs or a thought arises, and before automatically agreeing with it, before letting it trigger emotion and action, one examines it, asks whether it is true, whether it is helpful, whether it deserves to be believed. And in that pause, that small space of awareness, lies the possibility of choice, of responding rather than merely reacting. These practices were not meant to make one cold or indifferent. The Stoics valued love and friendship. They honored beauty. They celebrated the bonds of human community, but they sought to love without clinging, to enjoy without demanding permanence, to participate fully in life while remembering that nothing in it truly belongs to us, that we are custodians, not owners, stewards of roles and relationships that we will inevitably relinquish. There is something paradoxical here, something that resists easy summary, for the Stoic sage is both deeply engaged and fundamentally detached, caring intensely about virtue, about doing right, about fulfilling duties, while simultaneously accepting that outcomes are not fully within their control, that even their best efforts may fail, that justice may not prevail, that loved ones may suffer despite all care, and yet this acceptance does not lead to passivity, but rather to a peculiar kind of active serenity, doing what should be done without attachment to results, acting from principle rather than hope of success. This stance has sometimes been criticized as resignation, as making peace with injustice, as a philosophy for those who benefit from existing power structures. And there is some truth to this criticism. Stoicism can be misused to justify accepting what should be changed, to counsel patience when action is required, to confuse wisdom with compliance, but at its best, at its most genuine, it distinguishes between what can be changed and what cannot, and directs energy toward the former while accepting the latter, and this distinction is not always clear, often requires courage to discern. often demands that we act even when success is uncertain, because action is right, regardless of outcome. The real test of the philosophy comes in extremity, in the situations where nothing external remains, where every preference has been overruled, where only the interior citadel remains. And it is in such situations, in prisons and death camps, in terminal illness and irreversible loss, that the Stoic teaching proves its worth or fails. For if there is no inner freedom when outer freedom is gone, if there is no dignity possible in degradation, no meaning available in suffering, then the philosophy is empty consolation, beautiful words that collapse under pressure. But the testimony of those who have endured such extremities and found in Stoic principles a source of strength suggests that something real is present here, something more than philosophical abstraction, a genuine psychological resource, a way of preserving human identity and moral agency, even when everything else has been stripped away. The recognition that they can still choose, still judge, still maintain integrity, still exercise the last human freedom, the freedom to choose one's attitude, one's inner response, and in that choosing, to remain human, to remain oneself. And yet, the philosophy also speaks to ordinary life, to the everyday frustrations and disappointments, the minor slights and petty annoyances, the chronic low-grade suffering that comes from wanting things to be other than they are. And here, too, it offers relief, the simple reminder to distinguish what matters from what does not, to save emotional energy for genuine moral choices rather than squandering it on trivialities, to remember that most of what disturbs us is not worth the disturbance we permit it to create. The night around this garden has reached its deepest point. The stars overhead are brilliant now, countless points of light in the vast darkness, and the fountain continues, its voice steady, rhythmic, a sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, that marks time, while somehow existing outside of time. There is a sense, sitting here in this imagined space, this garden that exists between history and reflection, between the ancient world and the present moment, that something essential has been transmitted, not just information about a philosophical school, not just biographical details about long-dead teachers, but something more immediate, more alive, a way of seeing, a quality of attention that remains available, remains possible, regardless of when or where we find ourselves. The Stoics would say that this teaching is not theirs, that they merely articulated what nature itself reveals to anyone who observes carefully, who thinks clearly, who remains open to what is, rather than insisting on what they wish to be. And perhaps this is true. Perhaps the wisdom they codified is simply the wisdom that emerges when human reason aligns itself with reality, when we stop fighting the fundamental conditions of existence and learn instead to work within them, to find freedom not by escaping limits, but by accepting them, by focusing our energy where we actually have power and releasing our grip on everything else. The columns around us stand in their patient arrangement, some whole, some broken, and there is no difference in their dignity, no diminishment in their presence. They simply are what they are, shaped by time and weather, by forces they neither chose nor resisted. And in their stillness, there is a kind of teaching about acceptance without resignation, about endurance without complaint, about the beauty that remains when we stop demanding that things be other than they are. The fountain's water falls and rises, and each drop is unique, unrepeatable, and yet part of an eternal pattern. And we too are like this individual, temporary, precious in our particularity, and yet part of something larger, something that continues the great chain of being, the community of rational creatures, the cosmos itself unfolding according to principles we can observe, can align ourselves with, can find our place within. And so the story comes to rest, not with conclusions, not with answers that close off questions, but with an invitation to consider, to practice, to examine our own judgments and reactions with the same care that these ancient teachers brought to theirs, to notice the difference between what we can control and what we cannot, to invest our energy wisely, to remember that virtue, character, the quality of our choosing. These alone are fully ours. These alone cannot be taken. These alone determine whether we live well or poorly, regardless of fortune, regardless of circumstance. The stars continue their slow wheeling overhead, the patterns that guided sailors, that inspired poets, that reminded philosophers of the rational order pervading all things, and under those same stars, separated by centuries, by cultures, by languages and customs, human beings continue to face the same fundamental challenges, continue to ask the same questions, continue to discover, each in their own way, each in their own time. That peace comes not from controlling what cannot be controlled, but from understanding clearly what is up to us and what is not. The garden grows quieter still, the fountain's voice softer, more distant, as though we are slowly withdrawing, slowly returning from this space between times, this place of reflection and remembrance, carrying with us perhaps some fragment of what was offered here, some seed that might take root, might grow, might flower into understanding, into practice, into a way of being that honors both the difficulty and the dignity of human existence. And in the final stillness, in the last moment before silence, there is only the sound of water falling, rising, eternal, patient, marking time, measuring nothing, simply being what it is, what it has always been, what it will always be, the voice of nature itself, teaching what cannot be taught, only witnessed, only accepted, only joined, and the fountain falls and rises and falls, and the night receives all sound, all thought, all questions into its vast and gentle quiet. I walk along a river in the quiet hours, when mist still clings to the water, and the world feels like something painted long ago on silk. The river is the Yellow River, winding through a landscape of less plateaus and ancient valleys, and I am imagining a time thousands of years distant, when this same water flowed past settlements of earth and timber, when people first gathered along these banks and began to shape a civilization that would endure for millennia. The air is cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant mountains, and in my mind I see the land as it might have been in those earliest days, before the great dynasties, before the emperors and the scholars, when communities lived in semi-subterranean dwellings carved into the yellow earth, their roofs thatched with millet stalks, smoke rising from cooking fires into a sky that seemed infinite. There is something profound in tracing the thread of a culture back to its origins, to the Neolithic villages where pottery first emerged with distinctive markings, where jade was carved into forms both practical and sacred, where the rhythm of planting and harvest became the heartbeat of human existence. The Yellow River runs thick with sediment, earning its name from the color of the loess soil it carries from the highlands. And this very soil became the foundation of agriculture in northern China, fertile and workable, yielding millet and later wheat, sustaining populations that grew and clustered into larger settlements. I picture the villages of the Yangshao culture scattered across the central plains between 5,000 and 3,000 years before the Common Era. Their painted pottery decorated with geometric patterns and stylized fish, their dead buried with care and ceremony, evidence of a people who contemplated meaning and continuity. The Longshan culture followed, known for its thin black pottery, burnished to a lustrous sheen, vessels so delicate they seem almost impossible, crafted without the wheel, shaped by hand and tool into forms of extraordinary refinement. These were not isolated communities, but networks of influence and exchange, ideas traveling along waterways and across plains, techniques shared and adapted, the slow accumulation of knowledge that would eventually crystallize into something recognizable as Chinese civilization in the valleys of the Yellow River and the Yangtze, in the Central Plain and beyond. People were developing agriculture, domesticating animals, creating increasingly complex social structures, and somewhere in this gradual transformation, the seeds of written language were being planted. Oracle bones would come later, but even in these early periods, there were symbols, marks on pottery, signs that human beings were reaching toward a way to record and transmit what they knew, to speak across time. The landscape, I imagine, is one of cycles, the river flooding and receding, seasons turning with dependable regularity, and within this natural rhythm, human culture finding its own patterns, its own expressions of order and beauty. The mist on the river thickened slightly, and I think of how water itself became a symbol in Chinese thought, its fluidity and persistence, its capacity to shape stone through patient repetition, the way it seeks the lowest places and yet sustains all life. There is a particular quality to this imagining, a sense of deep time, of centuries layering upon centuries, each generation adding its contribution to a cultural foundation that would support towering achievements in philosophy, art, governance, technology. The villages grow larger in my mind's eye, evolving into walled settlements, social hierarchies emerging, specialized craftspeople, early forms of administration, the apparatus of what would become dynastic rule taking shape incrementally, organically, and always the river flowing through it all, witness to every change and continuity, carrying soil from the mountains to the plains, sustaining the crops that fed the people who built this civilization, grain by grain, idea by idea. The air grows quieter still, and I feel myself standing at the threshold of a vast historical landscape, ready to walk further into the depths of ancient China, to trace the development of one of humanity's great cultural achievements, to understand how wisdom and artistry and innovation emerged from these Yellow River valleys and spread their influence across millennia. The transition from scattered settlements to something more unified began in the mists of the second millennium before the Common Era, when bronze working appeared in the Yellow River Valley, transforming both warfare and ritual, creating objects of power and beauty that spoke of centralized authority and sophisticated craft. The Shang dynasty emerges from this period, the first Chinese dynasty confirmed by both archaeological evidence and written records, ruling from approximately 1600 to 1046 before the Common Era, their capital cities shifting over the centuries, but their cultural influence radiating outward with increasing force. At Anyang, the last Shang capital, archaeologists have uncovered the foundations of massive earth platforms that once supported palace structures, royal tombs filled with extraordinary treasures, and pits containing thousands of oracle bones, the earliest substantial body of Chinese writing. These oracle bones are pieces of turtle to plastron and ox scapula, carefully prepared, then inscribed with questions posed to the ancestors and the spirits, inquiries about harvests and warfare, childbirth and illness, the king seeking guidance from the realm beyond the visible. Heat was applied to the bone, creating cracks, and diviners interpreted these fissures as answers from the spiritual world. The questions and sometimes the outcomes were carved into the bone itself, creating an archive of royal concerns, of ritual practice, of a written language already remarkably developed. The script on these bones contains thousands of distinct characters, many recognizable as ancestors of modern Chinese writing, revealing a system that was not in its infancy but already mature, sophisticated, capable of expressing complex ideas and recording detailed information. The Shang kings ruled through a combination of military might and ritual authority. They were intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds, responsible for maintaining cosmic harmony through elaborate ceremonies and sacrifices. Bronze vessels cast specifically for ancestral offerings. These bronze vessels are among the most stunning achievements of Shang civilization, created through piece mold casting, a technique requiring extraordinary precision. Molten bronze poured into ceramic molds, assembled from multiple sections, producing vessels with intricate surface designs. Taotia masks with their mysterious staring eyes, dragons and other creatures, both real and imagined. The weight of a large Shang bronze is considerable, the metal itself precious. Requiring copper and tin in careful proportion, the resources and labor needed to produce such objects indicating wealth, power, the ability to command both materials and skilled workers. In the royal tombs at Anyang, these bronzes were buried alongside jade, weapons, chariots, and sacrificial victims, creating an afterlife retinue for the deceased king. The tombs themselves, vast underground chambers approached by sloping ramps, evidence of massive communal labor and social stratification. The Shang world was one of cities and surrounding territories, of agriculture supporting specialized craftspeople, of trade networks bringing in resources from distant regions, cowrie shells from southern seas used as currency, turtle shells from the south for divination, jade from far western sources. But beyond the Shang heartland, other cultures and peoples existed, some in tributary relationships, others independent, and among these were the Zhou, initially a frontier people to the west, gradually growing in strength and sophistication. The Zhou would eventually challenge Shang authority, and around 1046 before the Common Era, at the Battle of Muye, the Zhou forces defeated the last Shang king establishing a new dynasty that would prove to be the longest in Chinese history, though its effective power would wax and wane over the centuries. The Zhou justified their conquest through a revolutionary concept, the mandate of heaven, the idea that the right to rule came from heaven itself, granted to the virtuous and withdrawn from the corrupt, a justification for rebellion that would echo through Chinese political philosophy for thousands of years. Under this mandate, the Zhou kings presented themselves as sons of heaven, ruling through moral authority as much as military force. But the practical reality of governing a large territory led them to establish a feudal system, granting lands to relatives and loyal supporters, creating a network of vassal states owing allegiance to the Zhou king. The Western Zhou period, from approximately 1046 to 771 before the Common Era, saw the Zhou capital established near modern Xi'an, ritual and governance continuing many Shang traditions while introducing new elements, bronze inscriptions growing longer and more detailed, recording grants of land, military campaigns, ritual performances. These inscriptions provide historians with invaluable information, names and dates, relationships and events, the concerns and achievements of the nobility, the expansion of literacy beyond the court diviners to a broader administrative class. But the feudal system contained the seeds of fragmentation as vassal states grew powerful in their own right, as distances and local interests created diverging loyalties, and in 771 before the Common Era, the Zhou were forced to move their capital eastward to Luoyang after an invasion and the death of the king, marking the beginning of the Eastern Zhou period. The Eastern Zhou is traditionally divided into two phases, the spring and autumn period, from 771 to 476 before the Common Era, and the Warring States period, from 475 to 221 before the Common Era, a time of political fragmentation and intense cultural flowering. During the spring and autumn period, the Zhou king retained nominal authority, but real power lay with the feudal lords, who increasingly acted as independent rulers, engaging in complex diplomacy and frequent warfare, forming alliances and breaking them, competing for territory and resources. This was an era of transformation, iron tools appearing and gradually replacing bronze for agricultural implements and weapons, increasing agricultural productivity, supporting larger populations, enabling the expansion of cultivated land. Cities grew in size and sophistication, walls of rammed earth protecting populations that might number in the tens of thousands, markets and workshops, districts for different crafts, neighborhoods for various social classes. And it was during this period of political chaos and social change that Chinese philosophical thought experienced its most creative efflorescence, later called the 100 Schools of Thought, a profusion of ideas about governance, ethics, human nature, the cosmos. Confucius lived during the late spring and autumn period, born in 551 before the Common Era in the state of Lu, experiencing firsthand the disorder of his time, the decline of ritual propriety, the breakdown of traditional hierarchies. His response was to look backward to the early Zhou, which he idealized as a time of virtue and proper governance, and to advocate for a return to ritual, to ethical behavior based on humaneness and reciprocity, to a social order in which everyone knew and fulfilled their role. Confucius was not a religious prophet, but a teacher, gathering students who recorded his sayings, which would eventually be compiled into the Analects. Conversations and brief observations, emphasizing learning, self-cultivation, the importance of the past as a guide for the present. His influence during his lifetime was limited. He served briefly in government, but spent most of his later years teaching, traveling from state to state, seeking a ruler who would implement his vision, never fully succeeding, yet planting seeds that would grow into one of the world's great philosophical traditions. Around the same time, other thinkers were developing radically different visions. Laozi, if he existed as a single historical figure, associated with the Tao Te Ching, a text advocating withdrawal from conventional society, alignment with the Tao, the way, the underlying pattern of the cosmos, achieved through non-action simplicity, yielding rather than striving. The Tao Te Ching speaks in paradoxes and poetry, suggesting that true knowledge comes from unlearning, that strength lies in flexibility, that the best government is one that governs least, allowing people to live naturally without excessive intervention or artificial constructs. Mozi, founder of Mohism, preached universal love and condemned wasteful ritual and aggressive warfare, arguing for a pragmatic utilitarianism, actions judged by their benefit to society as a whole, a meritocracy in which the capable governed regardless of birth. These competing visions, Confucian emphasis on ritual and hierarchy, Taoist celebration of naturalness and spontaneity, Mohist focus on utility and universal concern, created a rich intellectual marketplace, ideas tested through debate and writing, schools forming around charismatic teachers. The Warring States period intensified both the conflict and the creativity. The feudal states, now essentially independent kingdoms, engaging in total war, mobilizing entire populations, developing new military technologies and strategies. 7 major states dominated this period: Qi and Chu, Yan and Han, Zhao and Wei, and Qin, each controlling substantial territories, each developing distinct administrative systems and cultural characteristics, yet all still recognizably part of a shared Chinese civilization. Iron weapons and tools became standard. Crossbows appeared, giving infantry new power against aristocratic chariot warriors. Armies grew to hundreds of thousands, campaigns lasting months or years, the scale of violence unprecedented. Yet this same period saw the construction of massive irrigation projects, the codification of laws, the expansion of trade, cities like Linzi in Qi, housing populations that may have exceeded 200,000, cosmopolitan centers attracting merchants and scholars from across the known world. The philosophers of this era grappled with urgent questions: how to create order from chaos, how to strengthen the state against its rivals, how to live ethically in violent times, and their answers shaped Chinese thought for millennia. Mencius, a Confucian thinker of the 4th century before the Common Era, argued that human nature was fundamentally good, that everyone possessed innate moral sense, that government should nurture this goodness through education and benevolent policies, that a ruler who failed his people lost the mandate of heaven. Sunzi, another Confucian, took the opposite view, arguing that human nature was fundamentally selfish, that only through education, ritual, and strict social norms could people be shaped into ethical beings. That order required active cultivation, not just release of natural goodness. The legalist school emerged, advocating for strict laws uniformly applied, for a powerful state apparatus, for rewards and punishments as the primary tools of governance, rejecting moral suasion in favor of institutional control, a philosophy that would prove attractive to rulers seeking to consolidate power. Among the warring states, Qin in the West had long been considered semi-barbarous, a frontier region, but it embraced legalist principles with ruthless efficiency, implementing reforms that transformed it into a military and administrative powerhouse. Shangyang, a legalist reformer in the 4th century before the Common Era, restructured Qin society from the ground up, abolishing the old aristocracy, creating a meritocracy based on military achievement, dividing the population into mutual responsibility groups, standardizing measurements, registering households for taxation and conscription. These reforms were harsh, punishments severe, but they created a state apparatus of unprecedented effectiveness. Agricultural production increased. The army became disciplined and motivated. Resources flowed to the central government, and Qin began its inexorable expansion. By 230 before the Common Era, Qin had conquered or absorbed all the other major states, and in 221, the Qin king proclaimed himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin, ruler of a unified Chinese empire, a political achievement that would define the region for over 2 millennia. The first emperor was a figure of immense ambition and energy. He standardized weights and measures across the empire, unified the written script, ensuring that despite differences in spoken language, educated people throughout China could communicate through a common written form, a decision with profound long-term consequences. He standardized currency, the wheel gauge of carts, so they would fit the same ruts in roads, creating an infrastructure of uniformity that facilitated trade and administration. He built roads radiating from the capital, connecting distant provinces, enabling rapid communication and troop movement. The Great Wall, though not built entirely by the first emperor, took its most ambitious form under his reign, connecting and extending earlier defensive walls, built by various states, creating a massive barrier against nomadic incursions from the north, a project requiring hundreds of thousands of laborers, many of whom died in the harsh conditions. This wall was not the stone structure visible today. That would come much later during the Ming dynasty, but rather rammed earth and wood, following mountain ridges and river valleys, stretching thousands of li across northern China, a statement of imperial power and paranoia. The first emperor's palace complex at Xianyang was said to be vast, though little remains, and he began construction of his tomb, a project that would continue throughout his reign and beyond, creating an underground palace guarded by thousands of terracotta warriors, each individually crafted, each with distinct features, an army for the afterlife. These terracotta soldiers stand in formation, life-sized warriors and officers, archers and cavalry, accompanied by horses and chariots, originally painted in bright colors, now mostly faded to bare clay. Their discovery in the 1970s revealing the scale of the first emperor's megalomania and the extraordinary skill of Qin craftspeople. But the first emperor's reign was also marked by intellectual repression. In 213, before the Common Era, he ordered the burning of books, particularly historical records and philosophical texts, seeking to eliminate alternative visions of governance and history to make his reign appear as the beginning of time itself, the culmination of civilization, rather than one phase in a long development. Confucian scholars, it was said, were buried alive for resisting these measures, though the historical accuracy of this claim is debated. What is certain is that the first emperor sought to control thought as thoroughly as he controlled territory, to impose unity of mind as well as political unity. His death in 210 before the Common Era came during a tour of the eastern provinces, his body transported back to the capital in secret, his chief eunuch and chief minister maneuvering to place a pliable son on the throne. But the regime they had built through fear and force could not long survive its creator. Rebellions erupted, sparked by conscripted laborers and disaffected peasants, spreading rapidly across the empire. And within 4 years of the first emperor's death, the Qin dynasty had collapsed, replaced by civil war, various factions competing for control of the empire that the first emperor had so recently unified. From this chaos emerged Liu Bang, a man of common birth, a minor official turned rebel leader, who outmaneuvered his more aristocratic rival, Xiang Yu, through a combination of a strategic patience, political flexibility, and willingness to delegate to capable subordinaries. In 206 before the Common Era, Liu Bang proclaimed the Han dynasty, taking the imperial title as Emperor Gaozu, establishing a capital at Chang'an, near the old Zhou capital, and setting about creating a more sustainable form of imperial rule than the harsh legalism of Qin. The Han dynasty would last, with one interruption, for over 400 years, from 206 before the Common Era to 220 of the Common Era, divided into the Western Han and Eastern Han periods, becoming the classical age of Chinese civilization, the period when many distinctive features of Chinese culture crystallized into enduring forms. Early Han emperors retained much of the Qin administrative structure, the system of provinces and counties, appointed officials rather than hereditary nobility, but they softened the harsh legalist edges, reduced taxes, relaxed punishments, and increasingly drew on Confucian ideology to legitimate their rule. Emperor Wu, who reigned from 141 to 87 before the Common Era, presided over the greatest expansion of Han power, his armies pushing into Central Asia, establishing the Silk Road trade routes, conquering territories in the south, in Korea, in Vietnam, creating an empire that rivaled Rome in size and sophistication. Under Emperor Wu, Confucianism became the official state ideology. Examinations based on Confucian classics became the path to government service, creating a bureaucracy of educated men, the scholar officials who would administer China for centuries, their authority based on learning rather than birth or military prowess. This marriage of Confucian ethics and imperial bureaucracy proved remarkably durable. The classics became the foundation of education, memorized and interpreted, providing a common cultural reference, a shared vocabulary of governance and morality, and the examination system, though it would evolve considerably over time, created at least the possibility of social mobility through education. The Han capital, Chang'an, grew into one of the world's great cities, perhaps 250,000 people within its walls, palaces and markets, workshops and warehouses, the Imperial University training thousands of students in the Confucian classics, preparing them for government service, beyond the capital. Provincial cities thrived, connected by roads and canals, trade flowing along these arteries, silk and lacquerware, iron tools and salt, grain and timber, a monetized economy reaching even rural villages, bronze coins strung on cords, standardized and ubiquitous. The Silk Road opened during the Han period, routes running west from China through Central Asia, connecting to Persia and eventually to Rome, carrying silk and spices, precious metals and glassware, but also ideas and technologies. Buddhism traveling east, Chinese inventions traveling west. Papermaking was invented during the Han, traditionally attributed to Kai Lun in the year 105 of the Common Era, though recent archaeological discoveries suggest paper may have existed in cruder forms earlier. This new material gradually replacing bamboo strips and silk as a writing surface, cheaper and more practical, enabling the spread of literacy and record keeping. Han artisans produced extraordinary works, silk textiles of breathtaking delicacy, lacquerware with dozens of layers polished to a deep luster, bronze mirrors decorated with intricate patterns, jade suits intended to preserve bodies in death, each piece sewn together with gold or silver thread, thousands of jade plaques precisely shaped and fitted. Han tombs, particularly those of the wealthy, were filled with minqi, spirit goods, ceramic models of houses and farms, granaries and pigsties, servants and entertainers, creating a complete miniature world for the afterlife. These objects now provide historians with invaluable evidence about daily life, architecture, technology, social structures. The tomb of Lady Dai at Mawangdui, sealed in the 2nd century before the Common Era and excavated in the 1970s, contained her remarkably preserved body, silk garments and banners, lacquerware and food offerings, and texts, medical treatises, and philosophical works. Versions of the Tao Te Ching older than any previously known, expanding our understanding of early Taoism. Historians during the Han period established patterns that would guide Chinese historiography for millennia. Sima Qian, writing in the late 2nd and early 1st centuries before the Common Era, created the Shiji, Records of the Grand Historian, a comprehensive history from mythical origins to his own time. Over 500,000 characters, biographies and chronologies, treatises on economics and ritual, astronomy and water management. Sima Qian suffered castration as punishment for defending a disgraced general, a humiliation that nearly drove him to suicide, but he persevered to complete his father's historical project, creating a work of extraordinary scope and literary power, establishing the biographical approach to history that would characterize later Chinese historical writing. The later Han, or Eastern Han period, began in 25 of the Common Era after a brief interregnum when the Wang Mang usurpation disrupted the dynasty. The capital moved east to Luoyang, and the empire reconsolidated, though with increasing power held by great families rather than the central government. Buddhism entered China during this period, traveling along the Silk Road from India and Central Asia, initially seeming strange and foreign. Monasticism and vegetarianism, the concept of reincarnation, all quite different from native Chinese traditions, but gradually being adapted and sinicized, translated into concepts drawn from Taoism, attracting imperial patronage. The first Buddhist temples were built, sutras translated into Chinese, often with considerable creativity, matching Sanskrit terms to Chinese philosophical vocabulary, creating a hybrid tradition that would eventually become distinctively Chinese. Chan Buddhism, Pure Land, traditions that would later spread to Korea and Japan. Meanwhile, Taoism itself was evolving from a philosophical tradition into an organized religion with priesthoods and rituals, sacred mountains and pilgrimage sites, techniques for achieving immortality through meditation, alchemy, dietary practices, sexual techniques, creating a rich tradition of esoteric knowledge and practice. The Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184 of the Common Era, led by a Taoist-led religious movement, marked the beginning of the end for the Han Dynasty. Widespread discontent with corruption and inequality, exacerbated by natural disasters, erupting into massive revolt, though the rebellion was suppressed. The dynasty never fully recovered its authority. Power devolved to regional warlords, generals commanding personal armies, and in 220, the last Han emperor abdicated, ending over 400 years of Han rule, China fragmenting into the Three Kingdoms period, a time of warfare and instability, but also of cultural vitality, of stories and legends that would inspire literature and art for centuries. The period following the collapse of the Han is known as the Age of Division, nearly 4 centuries of fragmentation from 220 to 589 of the Common Era, when no single dynasty controlled all of China, when the North and South developed along increasingly different trajectories, yet when culture and thought continued to evolve and deepen. The Three Kingdoms period, romanticized in later literature, saw the empire divided among Wei in the north, Shu in the southwest, and Wu in the southeast. Warlords and strategists engaged in elaborate campaigns, alliances shifting, battles celebrated in epic tales that blur history and legend. The romance of the Three Kingdoms, written over a millennium later, would immortalize figures like the cunning strategist Zhuge Liang, the loyal warrior Guan Yu, the ambitious general Cao Cao, creating archetypal characters whose stories became embedded in Chinese popular culture, performed in operas, painted on temple walls, referenced in everyday conversation. But the historical reality was one of devastation, populations declining from warfare and displacement, agricultural land abandoned, cities depopulated, and eventually even the Three Kingdoms proved unstable. Brief reunification under the Jin dynasty, then collapse into further division when nomadic peoples from the north invaded and established their own dynasties on Chinese soil. The north came under the control of non-Chinese rulers, Xianbei, Xiongnu, and other steppe peoples who adopted Chinese administrative practices and cultural forms while maintaining elements of their own traditions, creating hybrid cultures, sponsoring Buddhism as a unifying ideology that transcended ethnic boundaries. The South remained under ethnic Chinese dynasties, a succession of short-lived regimes based in Jiangkang, modern Nanjing, where aristocratic families dominated politics, where Taoist philosophy flourished, where poetry became increasingly sophisticated, where landscape painting emerged as a distinctive art form. This was the period when the scholar recluse became a cultural ideal, educated men withdrawing from politics to pursue spiritual cultivation, composing poetry in mountain retreats, discussing metaphysics while drinking wine, the 7 sages of the bamboo grove epitomizing this aesthetic of elegant withdrawal. Tao Yuanming, also called Tao Qian, poet of the late 4th and early 5th centuries, left government service to return to farming, writing verses celebrating the simple pleasures of rural life, chrysanthemums blooming by his fence, wine in earthenware cups, freedom from the corruption and constraint of official life, his poetry becoming a touchstone for later generations seeking authenticity and natural simplicity. Buddhism, meanwhile, grew from a foreign curiosity into a major cultural force, monasteries accumulating wealth and land, becoming centers of learning and art, cave temples carved into cliff faces at sites like Dunhuang and Yungang, walls covered with painted Buddhas and bodhisattvas, storytelling through image and color. The Yungang grottos, begun in the 5th century under the Northern Wei dynasty, contain enormous stone Buddhas, some over 50 feet tall, carved directly from the sandstone cliff, their faces serene, their robes flowing in elegant folds, synthesis of Indian Buddhist iconography and Chinese sculptural traditions. Monks traveled to India to study at the source, bringing back texts and teachings. Faxian in the early 5th century, Huanzang in the 7th century, their journeys arduous and dangerous, crossing deserts and mountains, years spent in study before returning with precious manuscripts and relics, their travel accounts providing valuable historical evidence about Central Asia and South Asia. Buddhist philosophy engaged Chinese intellectuals. The concept of emptiness, the nature of consciousness, debates between different schools, Tiantai, Huayan, each developing elaborate metaphysical systems, integrating Buddhist ideas with indigenous Chinese thought, creating something new from the synthesis. The Sui dynasty, 581 to 618 of the Common Era, finally reunified North and South after nearly 4 centuries of division, Emperor Wen and his son, Emperor Yang, undertaking massive projects, the Grand Canal, linking the Yellow River and Yangtze River systems, over 1,000 miles of waterway, enabling grain transport from the fertile south to the political center in the north. The Grand Canal required immense labor, millions of workers conscripted, many dying in the effort, but it created an infrastructure that would serve China for over a millennium. Water flowing through locks and across aqueducts, barges carrying rice and silk, salt and timber, binding the empire together through hydraulic engineering. But the Sui, like the Qin before them, exhausted their resources through over-ambition, costly military campaigns in Korea, massive construction projects, rebellions erupting, and the dynasty collapsed after less than 40 years, replaced by the Tang. The Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 of the Common Era, is often considered the golden age of Chinese civilization, a period of military strength, economic prosperity, cultural brilliance, and cosmopolitan openness, the capital Chang'an becoming the world's largest city, over 1 million residents within the walls, another 1 million in the surrounding area. Chang'an was laid out in a grid pattern, broad avenues running north-south and east-west, walled wards containing residences and shops, markets designated for Eastern and Western trade, foreigners from across Asia, Persians and Arabs, Sogdians and Koreans, Japanese monks and Tibetan emissaries, a truly international metropolis. The Tang legal code, completed in the early 7th century, synthesized centuries of legal development, providing detailed regulations for government administration, criminal and civil law, social hierarchy codified in legal status, penalties calibrated to the relationship between offender and victim, this code serving as model for later Chinese dynasties and for Korean and Japanese legal systems. Poetry reached heights of expression that still astonish. Li Bai, the romantic wanderer, writing of wine and friendship, mountains and exile, his verses seeming effortless, spontaneous, celebrating freedom and transcendence, while Du Fu, his contemporary, wrote with deep social conscience, documenting the sufferings of war, the separation of families, the corruption of officials, his craft meticulous, his compassion profound. Wang Wei, poet and painter, Buddhist layman, captured landscape in both words and images, his poetry visual, his paintings poetic, mountains emerging from mist, rivers winding through valleys, human figures tiny within vast nature, establishing conventions that would define Chinese landscape art for centuries. The examination system expanded during the Tang Jinshi degree, becoming the highest civil service qualification, thousands of candidates competing, only a few percent passing, success bringing prestige and office, failure meaning disappointment, and continued study or abandonment of scholarly ambitions for other pursuits. Buddhism reached its peak influence, temples and monasteries in every city and many rural areas, ordination conferring tax exemptions and other privileges, some estimates suggesting up to 200,000 monks and nuns by the 9th century. Concerns about Buddhist institutions accumulating too much wealth and drawing too many people away from productive labor, the Great Persecution of 845, ordered by Emperor Wuzong, forced thousands of monasteries to close, monks and nuns to return to lay life, precious metals confiscated. Though Buddhism survived this crisis, it never fully recovered its institutional power, becoming more integrated into popular religion, less of an independent force. The late Tang saw gradual decline, provincial military governors gaining autonomy, court politics dominated by eunuchs, tax revenues declining as powerful families found ways to avoid registration. The An Lushan rebellion of 755 devastated the north, the dynasty surviving but never fully recovering its earlier vigor. Poetry of the late Tang took on melancholy tones. Li Shangyin, writing verses of exquisite ambiguity, love and loss, political frustration, his imagery dense and elusive, demanding careful interpretation. Du Mu, looking back to earlier Tang glory, lamenting decline, writing of historical sites overgrown with weeds. When the Tang finally collapsed in 907, China again fragmented, the 5 dynasties period in the north. Rapid turnover of short-lived regimes, 10 kingdoms in the south, some maintaining relative stability and prosperity, but the overall pattern was one of disunity and uncertainty. Yet this period of political chaos saw continued cultural development, the invention of woodblock printing becoming widespread, enabling the reproduction of texts on unprecedented scale, Buddhist sutras, Confucian classics, almanacs and encyclopedias, knowledge no longer confined to hand-copied manuscripts. The Song dynasty, 960 to 1279 of the Common Era, reunified most of China, though never conquering all the territory held by the Tang, facing powerful neighbors to the north, the Liao dynasty of the Khitan people, later the Jin dynasty of the Jurchen, and eventually the catastrophic Mongol invasions, but militarily weaker than the Tang. The Song was economically and culturally vibrant, a commercial revolution transforming society. paper money appearing, credit instruments, joint stock companies, maritime trade expanding, Chinese ships sailing to Southeast Asia, India, even East Africa, ceramics and silk exchanged for spices and exotic woods. Cities grew to unprecedented size. Kaifeng, the northern Song capital, over 1 million inhabitants, no longer confined to walled wards but sprawling, shops lining streets, entertainment districts, tea houses and theaters, restaurants offering regional cuisines, a urban culture of consumption and leisure. Neo-Confucianism emerged during the Song, scholars like Zhu Xi synthesizing Confucian ethics with metaphysical concepts drawn from Buddhism and Taoism, creating a comprehensive philosophical system addressing questions of cosmology and human nature, self-cultivation and social order, this synthesis becoming orthodox for the remainder of the imperial period. Landscape painting reached new heights. Monumental hanging scrolls depicting towering mountains and misty valleys, hand scrolls unrolling to reveal journeys through space and season. Scholar painters like Mi Fu and his son Mi Yuren developing distinctive styles, emphasizing brushwork and personal expression over literal representation. Ceramics achieved extraordinary refinement. The pale green celadons, white dingware with incised decorations, black jianware, tea bowls prized by Japanese tea practitioners, the famous jianware with its opalescent glazes, each kiln site developing distinctive techniques, products traded throughout Asia. But the Song faced existential threats in 1127. Jurchen armies captured the capital Kaifeng and the emperor, forcing the court to flee south, the southern Song establishing a new capital at Hangzhou, abandoning the north, paying tribute to maintain peace, a humiliation that weighed on the Chinese historical consciousness. Hangzhou became perhaps the most sophisticated city in the world. Marco Polo would later describe it in amazed detail, though by the time he saw it, it was under Mongol rule, its canals and markets, pleasure boats and gardens, printing houses and schools, a urban civilization of remarkable complexity. The Mongol conquest, beginning with Genghis Khan's invasions in the early 13th century, culminating with Kublai Khan's final defeat of the Song in 1279, brought all of China under foreign rule for the first time. The Yuan dynasty, ruled by Mongol Khans, who were simultaneously Chinese emperors and part of a vast Eurasian empire. The Yuan period, 1271 to 1368, saw China integrated into the Mongol Empire's trade networks, the Silk Road flourishing under Pax Mongolica, merchants and missionaries traveling with relative safety from Europe to China, though Mongol rule also brought hardship, ethnic hierarchies, suspicion of the Chinese educated class, many scholars withdrawing from government service. Drama flourished during the Yuan, perhaps because blocked from official careers, educated men turned to writing plays, creating a golden age of Chinese theater, romantic comedies and historical tragedies, performances combining singing and dialogue, acrobatics and spectacle, plays like The Orphan of Zhao and Romance of the Western Chamber becoming classics. Painting also evolved as scholar amateur artists like Zhao Mengfu, developing styles that emphasized historical models and personal expression over realism. Literati painting becoming a distinct tradition, valuing brushwork and cultural allusion, disdaining professional decorative work, establishing aesthetic principles that would dominate later Chinese art. the Yuan dynasty fell to rebellion in 1368. Chinese rule restored under the Ming dynasty, which would last until 1644, a period of renovation and consolidation, of looking inward even as the world beyond China's borders was transforming. The Hongwu emperor, founder of the Ming, was born a peasant, orphaned her young, surviving as a beggar and Buddhist novice before joining a rebel movement and rising to leadership through military skill and ruthless determination. His reign marked by suspicion of the educated class and brutal purges of suspected disloyalty. Yet the Ming also brought stability after the chaos of the Mongol collapse, agricultural recovery, population growth. The capital eventually moved from Nanjing to Beijing, where the Forbidden City was constructed, a vast palace complex, hundreds of buildings within high red walls, the architectural embodiment of imperial authority and cosmic order. The early Ming saw remarkable maritime expeditions. Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch admiral, leading massive fleets into the Indian Ocean between 1405 and 1433, ships far larger than contemporary European vessels, crews numbering in the thousands, visiting Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, the east coast of Africa, displaying Chinese power, collecting tribute, bringing back exotic animals and diplomatic missions. But these voyages were discontinued, deemed too expensive and unnecessary. China turning inward, restricting maritime trade, even as European explorers were beginning their age of oceanic expansion, a decision whose consequences would become apparent only centuries later. The Ming was a period of cultural refinement, blue and white porcelain reaching perfection, cobalt designs on white bodies, firing at high temperatures, producing wares exported throughout Asia and eventually to Europe. Where Chinese porcelain inspired imitation and wonder, the novel emerged as a serious literary form. Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Water Margin, Journey to the West. Long narrative works drawing on oral storytelling traditions, sophisticated in plot and characterization, achieving recognition alongside poetry as legitimate literature. The examination system expanded, more men competing for degrees, printing making books more accessible, private academies supplementing government schools, success in the exams offering the primary path to social advancement, though corruption and the difficulty of the tests also generated cynicism. But the Ming faced persistent challenges, northern border threats, first from Mongols, later from the Manchus, a people from beyond the Great Wall who would eventually conquer all of China, Japanese pirates raiding the coast, internal rebellions, fiscal problems. The late Ming saw intellectual ferment. Wang Yangming developing a school of Neo-Confucianism, emphasizing intuitive knowledge and unity of knowledge and action, challenging Jushi orthodoxy, his ideas spreading among educated elites, stimulating debate about the nature of moral understanding. European Jesuits arrived in the late 16th century, Matteo Ricci gaining entrance to the imperial court through his knowledge of mathematics and astronomy, Western learning beginning to trickle into China, round maps showing continents the Chinese had not known, mechanical clocks, new geometrical proofs, the first sustained intellectual exchange between China and Europe. The Ming fell not to foreign invasion but to internal collapse, peasant rebellions driven by famine and misgovernment, a rebel army capturing Beijing in 1644, the last Ming emperor hanging himself on a hill behind the Forbidden City, and Manchu forces entering China ostensibly to restore order, but establishing their own dynasty, the Qing dynasty. 1644 to 1912 was China's last imperial dynasty. Manchu rulers who adopted Chinese governmental forms while maintaining their distinct identity, requiring Chinese men to wear the queue hairstyle as a sign of submission, initially facing resistance, but eventually presiding over territorial expansion and cultural flourishing. The Kangxi, Yongjing, and Qianlong emperors of the 17th and 18th centuries brought the Qing to its height, territorial control extending to Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, Taiwan, population growing to over 300 million by the late 18th century, economic prosperity, cultural production on a massive scale. The Qianlong emperor was a prolific poet and art collector, sponsoring massive encyclopedic projects, the complete library of the four treasuries, attempting to gather and categorize all significant Chinese texts, though also conducting literary inquisitions, destroying works deemed seditious. The authoritarian impulse accompanying the preservationist one, but the Qing faced challenges that would ultimately prove insurmountable: population growth outpacing agricultural expansion, environmental degradation, corruption, and beginning in the 19th century, aggressive Western imperialism seeking to open Chinese markets and impose unequal treaties, the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Uprising, reforms attempted and failing, revolution finally overthrowing the dynasty in 1912, ending over 2,000 years of imperial rule, China entering a period of upheaval that would reshape it fundamentally. And yet, standing at the river's edge again in my imagination, I realize that what endures is not the rise and fall of dynasties, not the dates of battles or the names of emperors, but something more elusive and more profound. It is the continuity of cultural practice, the unbroken thread of written language spanning millennia, characters evolving in form but maintaining recognizable connection to their ancient origins, enabling a Chinese reader today to encounter, with effort, texts written 2,000 years ago, to feel kinship across that vast temporal distance. It is the persistence of certain aesthetic values, the appreciation of negative space in painting, the calligraphic line that carries the energy of the writer's hand, the poem that suggests rather than states, finding beauty in restraint and implication, these principles established in ancient times, refined through successive generations, still resonant in contemporary art. It is the philosophical questions that each generation grappled with anew. How to balance individual cultivation with social responsibility, whether human nature tends toward good or requires strict shaping, how to create harmony between heaven and earth, between ruler and ruled, between self and society, Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist answers offering different paths, the conversation never fully resolved, the tension generative rather than paralyzing. The civil service examination system, for all its flaws, created something unprecedented, a bureaucracy based on learning rather than birth, the ideal, if not always the reality, that talent and effort could elevate anyone, that governance required education in ethics and history, that power should be exercised with cultural sophistication. The examination halls still stand in some cities, row upon row of tiny cells where candidates spent days writing their essays, hoping to demonstrate mastery of the classics, to craft the perfect regulated verse, to show both erudition and insight, the psychological pressure intense, the rewards for success substantial, this system shaping Chinese society for over a millennium. The landscape scrolls, whether northern Song, monumental mountains, or Yuan, literati bamboo, offer a way of seeing, of understanding human relationship to nature, not domination but participation, the human figure often tiny within vast space, finding place rather than conquering territory. The mist that obscures as much as it reveals, suggesting mystery, incompleteness, the Tao that cannot be spoken. These paintings were meant to be unrolled slowly, experienced over time, a journey through space that is also a journey through consciousness, the eye following the path of a river, climbing with a scholar toward a mountain temple, resting in a grove of pines, the experience meditative, the landscape becoming interior as much as exterior. The ceramics tell their own story, the evolution from earthenware to high-fired porcelain, the mastery of glazes, copper red and cobalt blue, the celadons that seem to glow from within, each piece shaped by human hands and transformed by fire, functional objects elevated to art, daily life infused with aesthetic consideration. Tea drinking itself became a ritual, a way of cultivating presence and awareness, the careful preparation, the appreciation of color and aroma, the company of friends, simplicity revealing depth, the mundane transformed into the meaningful through attention and intention, the gardens, rocks and water, pavilions and winding paths, windows framing views like living paintings, creating miniature worlds that compress and suggest the larger landscape, places for contemplation, for poetry composition, for the cultivation of refined sensibility, nature arranged but not dominated, wildness suggested within bounded space. All these practices, these forms, emerged from specific historical moments, were shaped by particular individuals and circumstances, yet they transcended their origins, becoming part of a cultural vocabulary that could speak across centuries, that could be reinterpreted and renewed, that could maintain identity while accommodating change, the dynastic cycle itself, the pattern of rise and fall, founding virtue and late corruption, natural disaster signaling heaven's withdrawal of mandate. This became a way of understanding historical time, not as progress towards some endpoint, but as perpetual oscillation, a pattern repeating with variation, human nature and cosmic principle playing out their eternal relationship. The mist on the yellow river thickens now in my mind's eye, and I feel the weight of all these centuries, not as burden, but as presence, the accumulated choices and creations of countless individuals, emperors and peasants, poets and potters, soldiers and monks, each living their particular life, each contributing to the vast tapestry. I think of the oracle bone diviners, carefully preparing the bones, carving their questions, interpreting the cracks, and how their script evolved into the characters still used today, 3,000 years of linguistic continuity, a bridge across time that few civilizations can claim. I think of the first emperor, building his terracotta army, burning the books, unifying weights and measures, his ambition terrible and magnificent, creating empire through force, yet the empire taking forms he could not have anticipated, outlasting his dynasty by millennia, becoming something other than what he intended, I think of the poets on the frontier, Du Fu writing of his thatched hut, damaged by autumn winds, worrying about the poor who have no shelter, his compassion surviving in verse, still moving readers, still asking us to see those who suffer. I think of the Buddhist pilgrims, walking for years to reach India, crossing deserts where earlier travelers had perished, driven by faith and curiosity, bringing back texts that would transform Chinese religion, creating new possibilities for thought and practice. I think of the craftspeople, the potters achieving perfect glazes after countless experiments, the scroll painters grinding their ink, stones, preparing silk or paper, attempting to capture mountain mist or bamboo swaying in wind, the accumulated skill and vision. The river flows on, carrying its yellow burden of loess, the same water and different water, perpetually changing and perpetually the same. This paradox that Chinese philosophers contemplated, that poets invoked, that painters suggested through mist and distance, the dynasties rose and fell like seasons, each bringing its particular gifts, each facing its inevitable decline, the pattern repetitive yet never exactly repeated, history as variation on themes, as elaboration of possibilities, as human nature encountering circumstance and creating culture, and what remains after all the palaces have crumbled, after all the emperors are dust, after the battles are forgotten, is this legacy of thought and making, of asking how to live well, of creating beauty, of seeking harmony, of recording and remembering. The scroll slowly rolling up, the ink fading on silk, the last light leaving the mountains, and somewhere a temple bell ringing across valleys, its sound carrying into silence, into the vast quiet, from which all things emerge and to which all things return. The river flowing, always flowing, through provinces and centuries, through memory and imagination, water that nourished the first millet crops, that filled the moats of imperial capitals, that carried trade goods south to north, that mirrored moon and mountain, that continues its patient journey to the sea, and I stand here at its edge, in this imagined space, as the mist closes in, the details softening, the specifics fading into general impression, the long story of ancient China becoming atmosphere, becoming feeling, becoming the quiet that follows deep contemplation, the last thought dissolving like mist, the last image blurring, the river and sky merging in gray, in silence, in the eternal now that holds all the vanished moments, all the forgotten names, all the extinguished lives, holding them gently, letting them rest, letting them be. The world was different once, so much larger than memory can hold, and quieter than we might imagine now. There were vast spaces then, places where the wind moved through grass that stretched beyond the edge of sight, and the earth itself seemed to breathe with a slower rhythm, a patience that belonged to ages we can only reconstruct from fragments. If we could step into that time, not as observers with notebooks and cameras, but as something lighter, something that could drift through the centuries like a thought, we would find ourselves in a landscape both familiar and impossibly strange. The air would taste different, cooler perhaps, carrying scents we no longer have names for, and the light would fall across terrain that existed in a state of constant transformation, neither fully one thing nor another, but always in the process of becoming. This was the world of ice and opening, of glaciers that carved valleys like rivers of frozen time, and of creatures whose very existence seems almost mythical now, almost too grand to have been real. But they were real, these enormous beings who walked across continents, who shaped the land simply by moving through it, who lived and died and left behind only the faintest traces of their passage, the mammoths, the giant sloths, the saber-toothed cats with their elegant and terrible grace, the cave bears and dire wolves, the mastodons and woolly rhinoceroses, all of them part of a world that functioned according to rhythms we struggle to comprehend. They moved through environments that were neither quite ice age nor quite temperate, but something in between, ecosystems that existed in a delicate balance, always shifting, always responding to forces larger than any single creature could perceive. Imagine standing in a place where the northern horizon glows with the pale blue light of distant ice sheets, while behind you grasslands roll away toward warmer regions, and between these two extremes, a rich belt of life flourishes in ways that seem almost impossible. The ground underfoot would be different, firmer in some places, boggy and uncertain in others, marked by the tracks of animals whose weight pressed deep into earth that froze and thawed with the changing seasons. And the seasons themselves would unfold with a different quality, longer perhaps, or more intense, with winters that lasted until the memory of warmth seemed like something invented, and summers that arrived suddenly, transforming the landscape almost overnight. In this world, herds of massive herbivores moved in patterns determined by the availability of plants, by the retreat and advance of ice, by instincts refined over hundreds of thousands of years. They were creatures of astonishing size, some of them with bodies designed to process enormous quantities of vegetation, to survive in conditions that would challenge any modern animal, to thrive in an environment that demanded both resilience and adaptability. The mammoths especially, with their curved tusks and thick coats of russet and brown fur, seemed almost designed by imagination, rather than evolution, too perfect in their adaptation to cold, too precisely suited to their world. But they were not alone, never alone, because this was an ecosystem of remarkable complexity, where predators and prey existed in relationships that had been refined over millennia, where scavengers and herbivores and carnivores all played their parts in cycles of energy and transformation. And beneath it all, the earth itself was changing, the climate shifting in ways that happened too slowly for any individual creature to notice, but which shaped the destiny of entire species over the long centuries. This is where we find ourselves now, drifting through that ancient time, not to study it with the cold eye of science, but to inhabit it, to let it unfold around us like a story being told in a language older than words, a story of ice and grass, of enormous bodies moving through mist, of extinction and survival, of a world that existed for so long it seemed eternal, until it wasn't. The story begins much further back than the mammoths themselves, back in timescales that resist easy comprehension, back when the very conditions that would allow such creatures to exist were still taking shape. Roughly 2.5 million years ago, the Earth entered a period of dramatic climatic oscillation, a time when ice sheets began their slow advance and retreat across the northern continents, transforming landscapes, creating new ecological opportunities, and setting the stage for the emergence of creatures unlike any that had come before. This was the Pleistocene epoch, a name that means simply most new, though there was nothing simple about the transformations it brought. The planet had been cooling gradually for millions of years, ice accumulating at the poles, ocean currents shifting their patterns, atmospheric circulation changing in ways that would ripple through every ecosystem on Earth. And as the ice grew, as glaciers began their patient grinding advance across what would become North America and Eurasia, the world reorganized itself around these new realities. Sea levels dropped as more and more water became locked in ice, exposing land bridges that had been submerged, creating connections between continents that had long been separated, allowing animals to migrate into territories their ancestors had never known. The ancestors of the great megafauna were already present, already adapting, already beginning the long process of specialization that would eventually produce the magnificent giants of the Ice Age proper in Africa, where so much of mammalian evolution had taken its course. Elephants were diversifying into multiple lineages, some of which would remain in warmer climates, while others began the slow migration northward into cooler regions. These early proboscideans, as scientists call them, were smaller than their descendants would become, less heavily furred, not yet fully adapted to the harsh conditions they would eventually master, but they carried within them the potential for transformation, the genetic flexibility that would allow their descendants to develop thick coats of hair, layers of insulating fat, compact ears that reduced heat loss, and all the other subtle modifications that distinguish a mammoth from its tropical cousins. The migration happened over countless generations, so slowly that no individual animal would have perceived it as a journey at all, just a gradual expansion of range, a following of food sources and favorable conditions. And as these populations moved north, they encountered new environments, grasslands that stretched across the cold steppes, tundra regions where specialized plants had adapted to short-growing seasons and permafrost conditions, forests of spruce and pine that grew in the slightly warmer interglacial periods. Natural selection worked its patient alchemy, favoring individuals with slightly thicker coats, slightly more efficient metabolisms, slightly better tolerance for cold, and over thousands upon thousands of generations, the mammoth lineage emerged, not all at once, but gradually, with different species arising in different regions, each adapted to its particular environment, each carrying forward the legacy of its ancestors while becoming something distinctly new. The steppe mammoth appeared first, enormous creatures that roamed across Eurasia, standing perhaps 4 meters tall at the shoulder, with tusks that curved in elegant spirals, designed for sweeping snow away from the vegetation beneath. They were creatures of the cold grasslands, the mammoth steppe, that unique ecosystem that has no real equivalent in the modern world, a mixture of grasses and herbs and flowers that could sustain enormous populations of large herbivores. And they were not alone in this transformation, this adaptation to Ice Age conditions. In North America, mastodons were following their own evolutionary path, cousins to the mammoths but distinct in form and habit, preferring forests to open grasslands, browsing on leaves and twigs rather than grazing on grass. Their teeth tell the story of this difference, cusped and designed for crushing woody vegetation, while mammoth teeth developed high crowns with parallel ridges, perfect for grinding the tough grasses of the steppe. Both lineages thrived, each in its own niche, and around them the ecosystem filled with other giants. Giant ground sloths emerged in South America, creatures that would eventually reach sizes comparable to modern elephants, with long claws designed for pulling down branches, and thick hides that protected them from predators. When the land bridge of Panama formed, roughly 3 million years ago, these sloths migrated northward, entering North America and diversifying into multiple species, some adapted to forests, others to more open habitats. In Eurasia, the woolly rhinoceros began its own transformation, developing the thick coat and compact body that would allow it to survive in the harshest conditions, growing its distinctive horn or pair of horns, becoming a specialist of the cold steppe alongside the mammoths. Cave bears appeared in Europe, massive creatures that were primarily herbivorous, despite their fearsome appearance, spending winters in deep hibernation in the limestone caves that would later preserve their bones in abundance. And the predators evolved in parallel, growing larger to match their prey, developing strategies and physical adaptations that would allow them to hunt animals many times their own size. The saber-toothed cats, with their elongated canines, were already ancient by the time the Pleistocene began, but they diversified into new forms during this period, becoming the apex predators of many Ice Age ecosystems: Smilodon in the Americas, Homotherium across multiple continents, each with its own hunting strategy, its own preferred prey, its own way of using those remarkable teeth to deliver killing bites. Dire wolves emerged in North America, larger and more heavily built than modern wolves, with powerful jaws designed to crush bone, pack hunters that could bring down prey much larger than themselves through cooperation and persistence. Short-faced bears appeared, the largest land predators of the Pleistocene, standing nearly 2 meters tall at the shoulder when on all fours, capable of running down prey across open ground, a hunting strategy unusual among bears. And in the oceans and wetlands, giant beavers emerged, creatures the size of modern black bears, building dams and lodges on a scale that dwarfs anything their smaller descendants construct. All of this diversification, all of this adaptation happened against the backdrop of the ice ages themselves, periods of glacial advance lasting tens of thousands of years, followed by shorter interglacial periods when the ice retreated and conditions became warmer. The cycle repeated, advance and retreat, cold and less cold, creating a dynamic environment that favored flexibility, that rewarded creatures capable of adjusting to changing conditions. During glacial maxima, when ice sheets covered vast portions of the northern continents, the megafauna populations would shift southward, following the vegetation, maintaining their ranges in the ice-free regions. During interglacials, they would expand northward again, recolonizing territories that had been buried under kilometers of ice, following the plant communities as they too migrated with the changing climate. This constant movement, this ebb and flow of populations, created patterns of genetic mixing and isolation, allowing new adaptations to arise, new species to emerge, while maintaining connections between distant populations. By around 500,000 years ago, the classic Ice Age megafauna were well established, The woolly mammoth had emerged from its steppe mammoth ancestors, smaller and more cold adapted, with even thicker fur and more efficient heat retention. The Columbian mammoth appeared in North America, slightly larger than the woolly species, adapted to the more temperate conditions south of the ice sheets, where forests and grasslands intermixed. The giant Irish elk was roaming across Eurasia, though it was neither exclusively Irish nor technically an elk, but rather a massive deer with antlers that spanned up to 3.5 meters, the largest antlers of any known deer species. And everywhere these creatures went, they shaped the landscape. Mammoths knocked down trees, creating openings in forests that allowed grasslands to expand. Their dung fertilized the soil and spread seeds across vast distances. Their footprints created depressions that filled with water and became habitats for countless smaller species. The megafauna were not simply inhabitants of their ecosystems, they were architects of them, keystone species whose presence determined the very structure of the environments they occupied. And so the stage was set, the cast assembled, the great drama of the Ice Age Megafauna entering its long middle act, when these creatures would reach their peak of diversity and abundance, when they would seem as permanent and eternal as the ice itself. And the peak came during what scientists would later call the last glacial maximum, a period beginning around 30,000 years ago and extending through to roughly 20,000 years before the present, when ice sheets reached their greatest extent and the megafauna populations achieved their fullest expression. Imagine the mammoth steppe at this time, a ribbon of land stretching from Spain in the west all the way across Eurasia to the Yukon and beyond, the largest biome Earth has ever known, unbroken by the barriers that fragment landscapes today. The grass grew differently then in communities that no longer exist, mixtures of sedges and forbs and herbs that could tolerate the extreme conditions, the long dark winters and brief intense summers, the dry cold air that pulled moisture from everything it touched. And across this grassland, herds of woolly mammoths moved in seasonal patterns, following the growth of vegetation, seeking out the river valleys in winter where slightly warmer microclimates allowed easier foraging, returning to higher elevations in summer when the snow melted and fresh growth exploded across the tundra. They were magnificent in their adaptation, standing perhaps 3 meters at the shoulder, covered in fur that grew in 2 layers, a long outer coat of dark guard hairs that could reach lengths of nearly a meter, and beneath that, a dense undercoat of fine wool that trapped air and created an insulating barrier against the cold. Their ears were small, far smaller than those of modern elephants, because large ears would have been a liability in freezing conditions, radiating heat that the animals could not afford to lose. Their trunks were powerful and precise, capable of both delicate manipulation and tremendous force, able to pluck individual flowers or uproot entire shrubs, to sweep away snow or to draw water from ice holes in winter. And their tusks, those great curved implements of ivory, served multiple purposes: defense against predators, competition between males during breeding season, tools for stripping bark or digging through frozen ground to reach the vegetation beneath. A mammoth's life unfolded in rhythms determined by the seasons, by the availability of food, by the social bonds that tied family groups together across decades. Females lived in matriarchal herds, led by the oldest and most experienced cows, who remembered the locations of water sources and mineral licks, who knew the migration routes and the places where predators were most likely to strike. Males lived more solitary lives after adolescence, joining the female groups only during breeding season, spending their years wandering across vast territories, occasionally forming loose bachelor groups, but never maintaining the tight social bonds that characterized female society. The young were born after pregnancies lasting nearly 2 years, emerging in spring when conditions were most favorable, when the adults could find the richest vegetation to support milk production. A newborn mammoth calf weighed perhaps 90 kilograms, covered already in a coat of reddish-brown fur, dependent on its mother and the protection of the herd, vulnerable to the wolves and cats that prowled the edges of mammoth territory. But within the safety of the group, calves could grow and learn, could develop the knowledge they would need to survive, could practice the behaviors that would sustain them through the long winters and lean times. They learned by watching, by imitating, by playing games that rehearsed serious skills, how to use the trunk effectively, how to dust themselves with soil to discourage parasites, how to recognize the calls of different herd members, how to read the subtle signals that indicated danger or opportunity. And around the mammoths, the rest of the ecosystem functioned in its complex interdependence. Woolly rhinoceroses grazed alongside them, stockier and more heavily built, with 2 horns made of compressed hair rather than bone, the front horn often flattened from constant use to sweep snow aside. They were more solitary than mammoths, except for mothers with calves, and more aggressive when threatened, capable of charging with surprising speed despite their bulk, their horn a formidable weapon against any predator. The giant Irish elk inhabited the more forested regions, the edges where grassland met scattered woods, where their immense antlers could be displayed to advantage during the autumn rut. Males would clash in contests of strength, their antlers crashing together, their powerful necks straining as each tried to force the other backward. Battles that sometimes lasted hours before one contestant finally yielded. The antlers themselves were grown fresh each year, an enormous investment of energy and calcium, requiring the elk to consume vast quantities of mineral-rich vegetation during the spring and summer growth period. By autumn, they would be complete, polished clean of velvet, ready for display, a signal of health and genetic fitness, visible from great distances across open terrain. In the forests of North America, mastodons moved through stands of spruce and pine, using their tusks to strip bark, their trunks to pull down branches, feeding on vegetation that mammoths could not efficiently process. They were built for a different life, shorter and stockier than mammoths, with straighter tusks and different tooth structure, adapted to a world of trees rather than grass. And in the same forests, giant ground sloths ambled along on their knuckles, their long claws curled inward to protect the sharp edges, reaching up to heights of perhaps 5 or 6 meters when standing on their hind legs, pulling down entire branches to access the leaves and shoots. They moved slowly, as their name suggests, but they were far from helpless, their size alone discouraging most predators, and their claws capable of inflicting terrible wounds if threatened. Some species of ground sloth excavated enormous burrows, tunnels wide enough for the massive animals to turn around in, extending for meters into hillsides, creating shelters from both weather and predators. The predators themselves were specialists in taking down these giants. Smilodon, the iconic saber-toothed cat, hunted in social groups much like modern lions, using cooperation and strategy to bring down prey animals that might weigh several tons. Their killing technique was different from that of modern big cats. Rather than the suffocating throat bite favored by lions and tigers, Smilodon used its elongated canines to deliver slashing bites to the throat and belly, opening major blood vessels, causing the prey to weaken from blood loss. This required getting close, required precision and timing, required the cooperation of the pride to position the prey animal correctly, to hold it while the killing bite was delivered. The saber teeth themselves were fragile in some ways, not designed for crushing bone or struggling with prey, but perfectly adapted for their specific purpose, slicing through hide and flesh and vessels with devastating efficiency. Dire wolves hunted differently in packs that ran down their prey over long distances, working in coordinated groups to separate young or weak individuals from the protection of the herd. They were built for endurance rather than speed, with powerful jaws that could crack bone to access the marrow within, scavenging when opportunity presented itself, but primarily hunting living prey. A dire wolf pack might number 10 or 15 individuals, organized in social hierarchies, cooperating in the raising of pups, defending territories against rival packs, their howls carrying across the frozen landscape on winter nights. The short-faced bear was perhaps the most formidable predator of all, standing taller at the shoulder than a modern grizzly, with longer legs built for pursuit rather than the shuffling gait of typical bears. Recent research suggests these bears may have been more scavenger than active hunter, using their size to drive smaller predators from their kills. But they were certainly capable of taking down prey when necessary, of using their tremendous strength to overcome animals much larger than themselves. In the far north, where the ice came closest, cave lions roamed, larger than any modern lion, with thick coats to protect against the cold, hunting across territories that might span hundreds of square kilometers. And everywhere, in every ecosystem, the smaller creatures filled their niches, the horses and camels and bison that grazed alongside the giants, the smaller predators and scavengers, the rodents and birds and insects that formed the base of the food web. This was a world of abundance, of productivity sustained by the unique conditions of the mammoth steppe, where nutrients cycled rapidly through the ecosystem, where the combination of cold temperatures and grazing pressure maintained grassland rather than allowing forest succession. The megafauna themselves maintained these conditions, their grazing preventing trees from establishing, their movements spreading seeds and nutrients, their dung fertilizing the soil and creating patches of enriched habitat that supported different plant communities. It was a system in balance, dynamic but stable, capable of absorbing disturbance and recovering, supporting populations of large animals at densities that seem almost impossible when we look at modern ecosystems. Thousands upon thousands of mammoths, rhinoceroses beyond counting, herds of horses and bison that darkened the plains, all sustained by the seemingly inexhaustible productivity of the Ice Age grasslands. And this abundance supported human populations too, the first modern humans who had begun arriving in these northern territories, following the herds, learning the patterns of migration and seasonal change, developing technologies and strategies that allowed them to survive in the harshest environments Earth had to offer. But that part of the story comes later. For now, in this peak moment, the megafauna reigned unchallenged, masters of a world that seems eternal in its frozen grandeur. The change, when it came slowly at first, so gradually that no single generation of animals would have perceived it. Just subtle shifts in the timing of seasons, in the distribution of rainfall, in the extent of summer warmth. Around 18,000 years ago, the ice began its long retreat. Not steadily, not in a simple progression, but in fits and starts, advancing again during cold snaps, then melting back further during warmer periods. The mammoth steppe began to transform, to fragment into smaller patches, as rising temperatures and changing precipitation patterns allowed trees to invade the grasslands, allowed forests to expand northward, breaking up the continuous ribbon of habitat that had sustained the megafauna for so long. In some regions, the changes were dramatic. Grasslands giving way to dense forest within a few centuries, the plant communities reorganizing themselves completely, the entire character of the landscape shifting. In other areas, the transition was more gradual, a slow encroachment of shrubs and trees, a gradual reduction in the diversity of grasses and herbs, a subtle decline in the productivity that had supported such enormous populations of large herbivores. The megafauna responded as they had always responded to environmental change, by moving, by following the suitable habitat as it shifted across the landscape, by adapting their behaviors to new conditions. But this time, the changes were different, more rapid than any the animals had experienced before, and compounded by a new factor that would prove decisive. Humans had been part of the Ice Age ecosystem for tens of thousands of years in Eurasia, their population small, their impact limited, living alongside the megafauna in relationships that were predatory but sustainable. They hunted mammoths, yes, using sophisticated techniques involving pit traps and coordinated drives, targeting vulnerable individuals, taking advantage of natural features to funnel animals into killing grounds. But the evidence suggests this hunting was selective, opportunistic, not fundamentally different from the predation pressure exerted by wolves and cats and bears, part of the natural pattern of mortality that every population experiences. Then, around 15,000 years ago in North America, around 13,000 years ago in South America, human populations began to expand rapidly, spreading into territories where the megafauna had never encountered human hunters before. These were not the gradual migrations that had characterized earlier human movements, but rapid expansions, driven by technological innovations, by population pressure, by the human capacity for cultural adaptation and learning. The Clovis people appeared in North America, named for the distinctive stone points they crafted, tools designed with devastating efficiency for penetrating the thick hides of large animals. They spread across the continent in perhaps as little as a few centuries, a blink of an eye in geological time, encountering mammoths and mastodons and giant ground sloths that had no evolutionary experience with human hunting. The animals had no appropriate fear response, no instinctive recognition of humans as dangerous predators, and this naivety may have made them especially vulnerable. In South America, the pattern repeated, humans arriving and spreading rapidly, encountering megafauna populations that had evolved in isolation, giant sloths and toxodons and enormous armored glyptodonts, all unfamiliar with human hunting strategies, and everywhere humans went, extinctions followed, not immediately, not in a simple cause and effect, but within a few thousand years. The megafauna began to disappear. The debate over what exactly happened, what combination of factors drove the extinctions, continues to this day among scientists, because the reality was almost certainly complex. Multiple pressures acting simultaneously, reinforcing each other in ways that made survival impossible. Climate change was clearly a factor. The warming temperatures, the transformation of habitats, the fragmentation of populations into smaller isolated groups that were more vulnerable to any disturbance. The mammoth steppe was shrinking, replaced by forest and tundra and wetland ecosystems that could not support the same density of large grazers, the productivity declining, the carrying capacity of the land diminishing, and as habitats shrank, populations became isolated from one another. Gene flow between groups declined. Genetic diversity decreased, making the animals less able to adapt to changing conditions, more vulnerable to disease and random catastrophic events. But the timing suggests that human hunting was also crucial, especially in the Americas, where extinctions happened rapidly after human arrival, where many species disappeared within a relatively short window. The hypothesis called overkill suggests that human hunters, encountering naive prey populations, could have driven extinctions through direct predation, taking unsustainable numbers, targeting reproductive females and young, removing individuals faster than populations could replace them. But perhaps it was not just the direct killing. Perhaps humans altered the ecosystems in other ways that proved equally devastating. The use of fire to manage landscapes, to drive game, to clear vegetation may have transformed habitats in ways that disadvantaged the megafauna, reducing the availability of food, creating barriers to movement, disrupting migration patterns, and perhaps the loss of keystone species created cascading effects. Mammoths disappeared, and the grasslands they maintained gave way to forest, which changed fire regimes, which affected other species, which altered predator-prey dynamics, each change reinforcing the others in a downward spiral. The extinctions did not happen all at once. Different species disappeared at different times, in different places, creating a complex pattern that researchers are still working to understand. Woolly mammoths persisted in northern Siberia until around 10,000 years ago, then disappeared from the mainland, but survived on isolated islands in the Arctic Ocean, on Wrangel Island and St. Paul Island, where small populations endured for thousands of years longer. On Wrangel Island, mammoths survived until around 4,000 years ago, contemporary with the pyramids of Egypt, the last of their kind living on a remote refuge while human civilizations rose and fell in distant lands. These island populations were smaller than their mainland ancestors, showing signs of inbreeding, genetic problems accumulating over generations, teeth growing abnormally, bones becoming more fragile. The population likely doomed even without human intervention. In North America, the Columbian mammoth disappeared earlier, around 13,000 years ago, along with mastodons and giant ground sloths and saber-toothed cats and dire wolves, a wave of extinctions that removed dozens of genera within a few thousand years. South America lost its megafauna even more recently. with some species perhaps surviving until 8,000 years ago in remote southern regions, the last of the giant sloths walking through forests that were already ancient. The woolly rhinoceros vanished from Eurasia around 14,000 years ago, the giant Irish elk around 8,000 years ago, the cave bears even earlier, each species succumbing to its own particular combination of pressures and vulnerabilities. And with each extinction, the ecosystem lost not just a species, but all the relationships and functions that species performed, the seed dispersal, the habitat creation, the nutrient cycling, the predation pressure that shaped the evolution of other organisms. The grasslands of the mammoth steppe collapsed without the megafauna that maintained them. Forests expanded, wetlands developed, the productivity declined, and the modern tundra emerged, a completely different ecosystem, unable to support large grazers at anything approaching Ice Age densities. Some scientists argue that we still live in an impoverished world, a planet that has not yet recovered from the loss of its megafauna, where ecosystems function in diminished ways because the giant herbivores that shaped them for millions of years are gone. The rewilding movement dreams of restoring some of these functions, of introducing elephants and other large animals to fill the ecological roles once played by mammoths, of recreating something approximating the productivity and diversity of the Ice Age ecosystems. But others point out that the world has changed too much, that the climate is different, that humans are too numerous and too impactful, that we cannot simply turn back the clock to an earlier state. The mammoths are gone. The saber-toothed cats are gone. The giant sloths and cave bears and woolly rhinos are gone, survived only by their bones in museums and their images in cave paintings. Echoes of a world that once was, yet something of them persists in the genetic legacy carried by modern elephants, in the permafrost that still yields their frozen remains, in the ecological gaps that their absence created, in the questions their extinction raises about our own relationship with the natural world, and perhaps most of all, in the sense of wonder and loss that their story evokes. The recognition that Earth was once home to creatures of almost unimaginable magnificence, that these creatures lived and thrived for hundreds of thousands of years, and that they vanished in what amounts to an instant of geological time, leaving us to contemplate a world made smaller by their absence, and to wonder what lessons their fate might hold for our own. The frozen ground of Siberia still holds them, preserved in permafrost that has locked away their bodies for millennia, mammoths so perfectly intact that their fur still carries the reddish-brown color it had in life, their skin still elastic, their eyes still holding the shape they had at the moment of death. Sometimes a tusk emerges from a riverbank, worn smooth by time and ice, carved by the Yakut people into art and jewelry, a connection to ancestors they never knew, but whose presence still haunts the landscape. Sometimes a complete specimen appears, revealed by erosion or melting permafrost, and scientists arrive to document and study, to extract DNA from cells that have waited tens of thousands of years in cold storage, to piece together the genetic code of extinction. The DNA tells stories the bones alone cannot, reveals that mammoth populations were more diverse than we imagined, that they migrated and mixed and separated in patterns that mirror the advance and retreat of ice, that they carried within them the accumulated adaptations of millions of years of evolution. Some researchers dream of resurrection, of using this genetic information to recreate mammoths, either through cloning or through genetic engineering of modern elephants, of bringing back at least some shadow of what was lost. The technical challenges are immense, the ethical questions perhaps even greater, but the impulse speaks to something deep in human nature, the desire to undo what has been done, to restore what was broken, to prove that extinction need not be forever. But perhaps the mammoths and their kin teach us something else, something more subtle and more important than the fantasy of resurrection. They teach us about impermanence, about how even the most successful adaptations, the most perfectly evolved forms, the most abundant populations, can vanish when conditions shift beyond some critical threshold. They teach us about interconnection, about how ecosystems function as wholes, about how the loss of one element can cascade through the entire system in ways that are difficult to predict or prevent. They teach us about timescales, about how processes that seem gradual can reach tipping points, about how stable systems can collapse with surprising speed once certain boundaries are crossed. The cave paintings of Lascaux and Chauvet preserve images of these animals, rendered by human hands that actually saw mammoths walking, that watched woolly rhinoceroses grazing, that tracked the movements of herds across the frozen plains. The artist captured something essential, not just the physical form, but some quality of presence, the weight and power of these creatures, the way they moved through space, the recognition of them as a fellow inhabitants of the world. And in capturing that, in leaving those images for us to find, they created a bridge across time, a way for us to glimpse what they saw, to feel some echo of the awe they must have felt. We find their bones in caves where they came to die, in tar pits where they became trapped, in river valleys where floods buried them in sediment, each discovery a window into the past, each specimen an individual that once lived and breathed and moved through a world we can only reconstruct. The La Brea tar pits in California have yielded thousands of specimens, dire wolves and saber-toothed cats that came to scavenge on trapped prey and became trapped themselves, their bones accumulating over millennia, creating an archive of death that speaks volumes about life. Each skeleton tells a story, old injuries healed and rehealed, showing that individuals survived attacks and accidents, that broken bones could mend, that these animals were resilient in the face of hardship. Some show evidence of disease, arthritis in aged mammoths, abscesses in saber-toothed cats, parasitic infections, all the ailments that afflict living creatures, reminding us that these were not mythical beings but real animals facing real challenges. And some show evidence of human interaction, mammoth bones with cut marks from stone tools, arranged in patterns suggesting deliberate butchering, dwellings constructed from mammoth bones and tusks in treeless regions where wood was unavailable. Humans and megafauna coexisted for thousands of years in relationships that were complex and varied, predator and prey, yes, but also fellow travelers in harsh landscapes, fellow survivors of Ice Age winters, connected in ways we are only beginning to understand. The story of the Ice Age Megafauna is not really about the past, or not only about the past. It is about the present moment, about the choices we face, about the responsibility that comes with being the dominant species on a planet still reeling from the last great extinction. We live in a world where elephants are endangered, where rhinos are poached nearly to extinction, where the remaining megafauna struggle to survive in fragments of habitat surrounded by human development, and we live in a time of rapid climate change, of ecosystems transforming faster than they did at the end of the Pleistocene, of species facing pressures they may not be able to adapt to, of the very real possibility of more extinctions to come. The mammoths cannot teach us how to prevent this. They are gone, but their story can perhaps teach us to pay attention, to recognize the signs, to understand that even the most abundant species can disappear, that even the most successful adaptations have limits. And so the mammoths walk through our imagination, through the museums where their skeletons stand assembled, through the documentaries and books and paintings that try to bring them back to life. They walk through the permafrost, still emerging, still being found by herders and hunters who know the land, who recognize the curve of a tusk or the dome of a skull appearing from the melting ground. They walk through the tundra that replaced their grasslands, changed beyond recognition, yet still carrying some trace of their presence, some subtle signature in the soil chemistry, in the distribution of plants, in the very shape of the landscape. And perhaps they walk through our dreams, these giants of the ice, these magnificent impossibilities, reminding us of a world that was larger and stranger than anything we know today. The wind still blows across the northern steppes, across Siberia and Alaska and the Yukon, but the herds are gone. The ground no longer trembles with their footfalls. The air no longer carries the sound of their calls across the frozen distances. What remains is silence and memory and the slow, patient work of science, trying to reconstruct what was lost, trying to understand not just how these animals lived, but why they died, what combination of factors proved too much, what threshold was finally crossed. The last mammoth somewhere on Wrangel Island 4,000 years ago, the very last one, knew nothing of extinction, knew nothing of being the end of a line that stretched back millions of years. It simply lived, and then it died, as individual creatures do, unaware that there would be no others to follow, that the story was ending, that the great saga of the mammoths was drawing to its close. And perhaps there is something almost merciful in that ignorance, in not knowing, in simply being alive in the present moment, eating and drinking and breathing, existing without the weight of a history or future. The Ice Age is over, has been over for thousands of years, but something of it lingers in the stories we tell, in the questions we ask, in the wonder we feel when we stand before a mammoth skeleton and try to imagine it alive, in the recognition that we live in the aftermath, in a world still shaped by what came before, still marked by absence, still carrying the legacy of the giants who walked here when the ice was young, and in the quiet acknowledgement, rarely spoken but always present, that we too are part of a story whose ending we cannot know, that we too live in a brief moment between ice ages, in a window of warmth that will not last forever. The mammoths have taught us what they can about adaptation and survival, about the limits of both, about the beauty and fragility of life in all its forms. Now they rest in the museums and the permafrost, in the paintings and the stories, in the slowly fading memory of a world that once was. And we continue carrying forward into whatever comes next, bearing witness to their existence honoring their memory, learning what lessons we can from their long journey through time. The story ends, as all stories do, but the mammoths remain, not alive, but not entirely gone, preserved in ice and bone and imagination, walking still through the frozen lands they once called home. And the wind blows on, across the tundra, across the ages, carrying with it the faint echo of their passing, the whisper of their presence, fading now, growing fainter, drifting away into the quiet spaces where memory becomes dream, and dream becomes the long, slow silence of deep time.